A game without victory. The blue note stood beside the highway where Nebraska dissolved into horizon. Dust lay over the parking lot in a thin, indifferent film. Inside, the air carried the smell of old coffee, earned grease, and wet wool that never fully dried. Nothing in the room demanded attention. The vinyl booths had split at the seams. The counter leaned slightly, as if tired of holding itself upright. It was not sadness that filled the diner. It was fatigue settled into the walls like a second coat of paint. On the corner table rested a chessboard swollen by years of damp. The white squares had yellowed. The black ones had faded to an uncertain gray. The pieces did not belong to one set. A white rook had been replaced by a plain metal nut. The black king's crown was chipped, its edge rough as a broken tooth. These objects remembered hands that no longer came through the door. They held warmth the way wood holds smoke. Henry sat by the window. His hands were heavy and veined, like roots pressing through dry soil. He did not look at the board. He looked at the road. Headlights slid across the glass and disappeared without slowing. He wore a gray jacket slightly too large for him, as if the man inside had diminished over the years. His reflection in the window trembled each time a truck passed. Eli arrived without noise and took the seat opposite. He moved carefully, as though the room might crack under sudden motion. He placed a crumpled pack of cheap cigarettes on the table and rested his palms beside the board. His silence was different from Henry's sharper, less resigned. They did not greet each other. The game had begun 10 years ago and had never truly ended. Henry pushed a pawn forward. The wooden piece struck the board with a small, definite sound. It was not strategy. It was confirmation. The coffee in his cup rippled from the vibration of a passing semi. Smoke rose from Eli's cigarette in a straight line until it met the slow, indifferent fan above them. Outside, beyond the dusty glass, the factory chimney stood black against the sky. It had not smoked in 12 years. Inside the blue note, the game continued, not toward victory, but away from ending. Eli studied the board as if it were a map of a country he no longer believed in. The pawn Henry had moved stood alone in its square, modest and exposed. Outside, the wind dragged dust along the highway in low spirals. A freight truck roared past without slowing, its sound entering the diner a second too late, as if even noise had grown cautious here. The coffee between them steamed faintly, then stopped. Eli reached for his knight. The piece was darker than the rest, its base worn smooth by years of being lifted and set down again. He moved it in a careful arc. The chair beneath him gave a tired creak. It was a bold square to choose, though neither man believed in boldness anymore. Risk had become something that belonged to younger hands. They had once worked in the factory beyond the fields. Henry on the presses, Eli on assembly. The machines had spoken all day, then metal against metal, a language of impact and repetition. When the factory closed, the silence that followed was not relief. It was subtraction. The town did not collapse at once. It thinned. Houses emptied, windows darkened. The blue note remained, as if habit alone could keep it upright. The waitress refilled their cups without asking. Her shoes made a soft, practical sound against the floor. She did not look at the board. For her, they were two men aging at a table. She moved away, and the clock above the counter ticked with deliberate patience. Each second fell into place like a small, unavoidable stone. Henry saw the line of the game opening before him. In 3 moves, perhaps 4, he could press forward and force the shape of things. He rested his fingers on the metal nut that served as his rook. It was cool and weighty. He adjusted it slightly, not enough to count as a move. Outside, the sky shifted toward a dull violet. The board between them waited, patient as the horizon. The rain began without warning. It struck the tin roof in a dry metallic rhythm, harder than it looked from the window. The sound filled the pauses between them, steady and impersonal. Water traced thin lines down the glass, blurring the highway until the passing lights became pale smears. The factory chimney disappeared behind a veil of gray. Eli leaned back and exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. The fan caught it and broke it apart. "Your move," he said, his voice low and unused, like a tool taken down from a wall after years. It was the first sentence spoken in an hour. The words did not disturb the room. They settled into it. Henry did not answer. He studied the board as though it had altered in his absence. He could see the path clearly now. A sacrifice, a quiet advance, and then the corner would close. Victory was there, patient and simple. He imagined the final arrangement. Eli's king boxed in, the chipped crown tilted in resignation. It would be clean. It would also be an ending. He placed his hand on the edge of the board instead. His thumb brushed the metal nut that stood for a rook. He wiped a thin layer of dust from it with a gesture gentler than any he could remember making. The rain grew heavier. Somewhere near the counter, a glass rattled faintly. Eli watched him. He understood without looking at the squares. There would be no checkmate tonight. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and crushed his cigarette into the ashtray they shared. The ember died with a small hiss. They rose without shaking hands. The bell above the door gave a brief metallic jolt as Eli stepped into the ring. Henry remained by the table, the unfinished game before him. Outside, taillights dissolved into the wet distance. Inside, the clock continued its narrow duty, and the coffee in his cup cooled toward nothing. Morning entered the blue note without enthusiasm. The rain had passed in the night, leaving the highway rinsed but unchanged. A thin light spread across the tables and caught in the scratches of the chessboard. Dust would return by noon. It always did. The waitress switched on the coffee machine, and its low gurgle replaced the silence with something mechanical and dependable. Henry was already seated. He had not gone home. The gray jacket hung loosely from his shoulders, as if it too had grown tired of carrying him. The unfinished game stood where they had left it. The pieces looked smaller in daylight. The metal nut that served as a rook reflected a pale, indifferent gleam. Henry wrapped both hands around his cup, not for warmth, but for weight. Outside, the factory chimney stood clear again, a black line against a sky that promised nothing. A school bus passed without stopping. 2 pickups crossed the intersection and continued west. No one looked toward the diner. No one ever did. The town moved in straight lines now, without detours. Eli entered just after 8. He removed his cap and nodded once. There was a faint stiffness in the way he lowered himself into the chair, as if the night had left something lodged in his back. He did not speak. He did not need to. The board was still between them. The game, paused but not concluded, waited like a shared obligation. Henry studied the position again. The path to victory remained. It had not softened with sleep. He lifted the metal rook. Its coolness startled him, and held it suspended above the square that would begin the end. For a moment, the diner seemed to narrow around the gesture. Then he set the piece back where it had been. Eli reached for a pawn instead and moved it 1 square forward. The sound was small, almost lost beneath the hum of the refrigerator. It was not a strong move. It was not meant to be. Outside, the light strengthened over the flat fields. Inside, the game continued, not toward triumph, but toward another day that would resemble the last. By noon, the dust had returned. It settled along the window ledge and gathered in the seams of the board. The light grew whiter, harsher, flattening the room until everything seemed cut from the same tired material. The waitress moved between tables with the slow certainty of someone who no longer expects surprise. The blue note held its shape against the day, not proudly, but out of habit. Henry removed his jacket and folded it over the back of his chair. His shirt hung loosely on his frame. The veins in his forearms stood out as he reached for his cup. He had once lifted steel sheets with these hands, had steadied trembling machinery with a grip that did not falter. Now they hovered above carved wood, uncertain and deliberate. Eli's cigarette burned down to the filter. He crushed it without looking and immediately lit another. Smoke layered the air until the fan could no longer keep it straight. He moved his bishop along a diagonal that threatened nothing and protected even less. The move was patient, almost tender. It preserved the board's balance. A delivery truck stopped briefly outside, engine idling. The driver stepped in for coffee and left without glancing toward the corner table. The bell over the door gave its thin complaint and fell silent again. Through the glass, the factory chimney stood unchanged, the town's only monument to what had been. Henry saw it then, the small mistake Eli had made. 2 moves, perhaps 3, and the position would break open. He touched the pawn that would begin the sequence. The wood felt warm from the room. For a moment he imagined finishing it, clearing the board, rising from the table with a finality that would echo. Instead, he shifted his hand away and adjusted the metal rook by a fraction. Eli watched the gesture and nodded almost imperceptibly. He understood the mercy in it and the refusal. The clock above the counter marked another minute. Outside, the highway shimmered in the heat. Inside, the pieces remained upright. The game endured, not because it demanded resolution, but because ending it would leave them with nothing but the open afternoon. Toward evening, the light thinned and turned the color of old tin. The highway lost its glare and began to breathe out the heat it had gathered all day. Inside the blue note, shadows stretched across the board, lengthening the squares until they looked uneven. The fan continued its slow rotation, stirring smoke and memory without conviction. Henry's coffee had gone cold again. He did not ask for more. The cup remained before him like an object placed to prove his presence. He studied the board without calculation now. The moves had become gestures, almost ceremonial. Each piece carried the weight of repetition. The metal rook stood slightly apart, its dull sheen catching the last of the light. Eli's hands trembled faintly as he reached for his knight. Age had entered them quietly over the years, settling into the joints. He moved the piece and withdrew his hand at once, as though the contact had cost him something. Outside, a train horn sounded far off across the field's long, hollow, indifferent. It passed through them and faded. They did not speak of the factory, of wives who had left, of children who had grown into strangers. Those subjects lay between the squares, invisible but present. The board absorbed what they would not name. It offered a structure in place of confession, a boundary to the emptiness beyond the glass. The waitress turned on the lights above the counter. They flickered once before holding. The pieces cast sharper shadows now, small monuments to endurance. Henry felt the familiar line opening again, an endgame forming with quiet precision. He could close it. He could let it conclude in a clean and final arrangement. Instead, he moved a pawn 1 square forward. A simple, delaying step. Eli watched and answered in kind. Outside, the horizon darkened into a bruised violet. Inside, the game carried on under artificial light, neither advancing nor retreating, held together by the stubborn, while not to let the board fall silent. Night settled without ceremony. The highway thinned to occasional headlights sliding past like indifferent thoughts. The blue note's neon sign flickered in tired blue pulses against the dark, humming faintly through the glass. Inside, the air had grown dense with smoke and the residue of long hours. The board remained between them, steady as a small altar. Henry's back ached now. He shifted in his chair, but did not stand. The game had moved into an end that neither man would admit. Pieces were sparse. The board showed more emptiness than conflict. The metal rook still guarded its square, patient and unused. Henry traced the grain of the wood with his thumb, as if reading something written there years ago. Eli removed his cap, and set it beside the ashtray. His hair had thinned to a gray halo that caught the light. He leaned forward and studied the position with a seriousness that once belonged to wages and deadlines. There was a narrow path left, one precise sequence, and it would be done. His jaw tightened slightly, then relaxed. Outside, a stray dog crossed the parking lot and disappeared behind the dumpsters. The wind pushed a paper cup along the curb until it lodged against a tire. The town did not resist the dark. It absorbed it. From the kitchen came the soft clatter of dishes being stacked for the night. Henry lifted the metal rook at last. It felt heavier than before, as if it had absorbed the hours. He set it down in a square that opened the board completely. It was not the winning move. It was the honest one. Eli looked at the new arrangement and understood what had been given up. For a long moment, neither man touched the pieces. The refrigerator hummed. The neon sign buzzed outside. Then Eli moved his king into the open, exposing it without defense. It was not surrender. It was acknowledgement. The board now held nothing but two men facing what remained. And in the quiet that followed, the game finally resembled their lives reduced, unguarded, and still not finished. The hour grew late enough that the waitress no longer refilled their cups. She wiped the counter in slow, practiced arcs, and glanced toward the clock as if measuring how much longer the lights must remain on. Outside, the neon sign faltered, then steadied. The highway carried only the occasional truck now, each one passing without hesitation, as though the town were something to move through quickly. On the board, little remained. Two kings, a rook of metal, a scattering of pawns like forgotten nails on a workshop floor. The rest had been lifted away, one by one, set aside without ceremony. The emptiness between the pieces felt wider than before. It was no longer a contest. It was arrangement. Henry watched Eli's king standing exposed in the open file. One clean line would end it. He saw it clearly, the square, the angle, the final quiet tab of wood. His hand hovered above the metal rook. The diner seemed to narrow around the gesture. Even the hum of the refrigerator felt closer. Eli did not lower his eyes. He kept them on the board, jaw set, as if awaiting a verdict he already knew. There was no plea in his posture, only acceptance. The lines in his forehead looked deeper in the artificial light, each one a mile traveled and not returned. Henry let his hand fall to the table instead. He did not take the move. The decision was not dramatic. It was small, almost invisible. He reached for a pawn and nudged it forward one square, an inconsequential motion that changed nothing and preserved everything. The metal rook remained where it was. Eli exhaled slowly. He shifted his king back, retreating into a corner that offered no real shelter. The board held them there, suspended between ending and continuation. Outside, the wind pressed dust against the windows again. Inside, the clock marked another minute. The game went on not because it demanded resolution, but because finishing, it would leave them alone with the full weight of the night. The waitress announced closing time without raising her voice. She said it the way one mentions the weather, without expectation of response. Chairs were turned upside down on distant tables. The smell of detergent joined the stale coffee and smoke. The blue note began to empty itself of the day. Henry looked at the board as though memorizing it. The pieces stood in their uneasy truce. Kings reduced to cautious squares, the metal rook still unused, a few pawns stranded without purpose. Under the fluorescent lights, they cast thin shadows like fence posts in winter fields. Nothing about the position suggested victory. It suggested endurance. Eli rose first this time. His knees straightened slowly, as if negotiating with the weight above them. He placed his cap back on his head and slid the crumpled cigarette pack into his pocket. For a moment, he rested his palm lightly on the edge of the table. It was not farewell. It was acknowledgement of the hours spent there. Henry gathered the pieces without ceremony. He did not reset the board. He placed the kings in the same box, their carved faces turned toward one another in darkness. The metal rook only a dull nut, he held a second longer before dropping it in with the rest. The sound was small and final. They stepped outside together. The air had cooled. The dust had settled into a thin skin over the parked pickups. The factory chimney stood black against a sky emptied of color. No lights burned in its windows. No sound came from its walls. Eli nodded once and walked toward his truck. His taillights flared briefly, then merged with the road's distant glow. Henry remained by the diner door. The neon hummed above him, uncertain but still alive. He did not feel relief or loss. He felt the simple fact of standing there, in the open dark. After a moment, he turned back inside. The board lay bare on the table, squares exposed and unguarded. He set it upright against the wall and switched off the lights. In the darkness, the diner held its shape. Tomorrow, they would take the pieces out again, and the game, like the town, would resume without promise and without complaint. Morning returned with a pale, reluctant light. The highway was already awake, engines moving west with quiet determination. Dust lifted early and drifted across the parking lot in thin veils. The Blue Note opened its door as it always had, without ceremony. Inside, the air still carried the memory of smoke. Henry entered before the coffee had fully brewed. He paused near the corner table where the board had stood. For a moment, he looked at the empty surface, as if expecting to find the pieces arranged by some unseen hand. The wood bore faint impressions where the board had rested. Marks remained longer than intentions. The waitress placed a cup before him. "Early," she said, not unkindly. He nodded. Words felt unnecessary this hour. Through the window, the factory chimney cut into the morning sky like a line drawn and never erased. A school bus passed again. The town repeated itself with disciplined precision. Eli arrived later than usual. There was a hesitation in his step, a slight delay before he crossed the threshold. He saw the bare table and stopped. For a second, something like confusion crossed his face, quickly hidden. Henry reached into the drawer beneath the counter and took out the box without speaking. They set the board down together. The pieces emerged one by one, placed in their customary ranks. The metal rook rolled briefly before Henry steadied it with his thumb. No one mentioned the previous night. No one spoke of endings. The first move was made as simply as before. Outside, the horizon lay flat and undecided. Inside, wood touched wood with a small, definite sound. The game began again, not to change what had been, but to occupy what remained. And in that measured repetition, beneath the hum of the refrigerator and the thin light of morning, there was a quiet form of survival. By midday, the heat pressed low over the town, flattening sound and color. The highway shimmered as though it might dissolve at any moment. Inside the Blue Note, the air felt heavier, thick with yesterday's smoke and today's coffee. The board between them had reached its middle again, pieces clustered in cautious proximity. Henry wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. Sweat gathered at his temples and traced quiet paths downward. He studied the position with an attention that bordered on fatigue. The metal rook stood blocked behind a pawn, patient and uncomplaining. He considered freeing it, then left it where it was. Eli shifted in his chair. The wood creaked beneath him in protest. He had removed his cap and set it beside the ashtray, as though the game required that small gesture of respect. His fingers hovered above a bishop before retreating. Outside, a siren wailed briefly somewhere beyond the fields, then fell silent again. They had once measured days in production quotas and overtime hours. Now they measured them in moves. The board offered resistance without consequence. It was enough. Each advance, each exchange replaced a conversation neither man wished to begin. Henry finally moved the pawn that freed the metal rook. The path opened slowly, square by square. Eli responded with care, neither aggressive nor yielding. The game tightened, then relaxed, then tightened again. Nothing decisive occurred. Through the window, a young couple paused near the gas pump across the road. They laughed at something small and got back into their car. The sound did not reach the diner. Inside, the clock continued its narrow duty. The men bent over the board, adjusting, delaying, sustaining. When Henry realized he had once more created the possibility of ending it, he felt no urgency. The move could wait. The afternoon would pass regardless. He rested his hand on the table and allowed the moment to stretch. The game endured, as it always had, not as competition, but as proof that they were still capable of placing something carefully into the world and watching it remain. Late afternoons settled like a thin film over the diner windows. The light turned amber, then slowly drained toward gray. The highway traffic thinned again, leaving long intervals of near silence between passing engines. Inside the Blue Note, the hum of the refrigerator grew more distinct, as if claiming the room. The board had emptied once more. Exchanges had been made without comment. A bishop lay in the box beside the table, its felt base worn smooth. Only the kings, a few pawns, and the metal rook remained. The position was narrow, almost fragile. One mistake would be enough. Henry leaned back and studied Eli rather than the board. The lines around Eli's mouth had deepened. His eyes, once quick to follow a moving piece, now lingered a second too long. Age did not arrive dramatically. It settled like dust on a pickup hood. Henry lowered his gaze again and traced the edges of the squares with his eyes. Eli moved the pawn forward, slow and deliberate. The piece made its small wooden sound. He did not look up afterward. It was a waiting move. It did not threaten. It postponed. Outside, a cloud passed over the sun, and the diner dimmed briefly before brightening again. Henry saw the final path clearly now. There would be no elegance to it, only a straightforward closing. He touched the metal rook, feeling the coldness that did not belong to wood. For a moment, he imagined allowing it, ending the arrangement cleanly, acknowledging that even this ritual had limits. Instead, he shifted his king one square to the side. It was a neutral gesture, almost invisible. Eli glanced at him, then nodded faintly. The afternoon loosened its grip on the town. In the fading light, the pieces remained upright. The game held together not because it promised anything, but because neither man was prepared to sit across from the other, with nothing left between them. Evening returned with a low wind that carried the smell of dry fields through the cracks in the door. The neon sign outside flickered on, bathing the window in a tired blue glow. Inside, the light above their table buzzed faintly, casting a pale circle over the board. The rest of the diner receded into shadow. The position had grown delicate. Two pawns faced each other in the center, like men unwilling to step aside. The metal rook stood free now, unobstructed, its dull surface catching the artificial light. Henry's fingers rested near it, but did not close. He could feel the end approaching again, not as triumph, but as subtraction. Eli cleared his throat softly. It was a small human sound in a room that had forgotten conversation. He leaned forward and studied the squares with a steadiness that bordered on stubbornness. There was a line that would force Henry's hand, push the game toward its natural conclusion. He saw it. He let it pass. Outside, a motorcycle roared briefly down the highway, its engine loud and young. The sound cut through the diner and was gone. Henry watched the dust settle again in its wake. The town absorbed even noise without resistance. He lifted the metal rook at last. The weight surprised him again, heavier than its size suggested. He placed it carefully, not on the square that would end the game, but one that kept the balance intact. A postponement disguised as caution. Eli's lips pressed into something like a faint smile. He answered with a pawn move, closing the file Henry had opened. The board tightened once more. Around them, the waitress began stacking chairs for the night. The refrigerator hummed. The neon buzzed. And under the thin circle of light, the pieces remained standing, held in place by two men who understood that some endings, once reached, cannot be undone. The diner was nearly empty now. Only the corner table remained untouched by the waitress's slow preparations for closing. Chairs stood inverted along the counter like quiet witnesses. Outside, the neon sign pulsed unevenly, its blue glow thinning at the edges. The highway carried one last truck eastward, its headlights cutting briefly across the glass before vanishing. On the board, the game had narrowed to its barest form. Two kings, the metal rook, and a single pawn on each side. The squares between them felt exposed, stripped of distraction. Every move now carried weight. Every square mattered. Henry leaned closer, his elbows resting on the warm table, and studied the arrangement as though it were a map of a country reduced by war. Eli's breathing had grown slower. He no longer reached for cigarettes. His hands lay flat beside the board, fingers slightly curled. He understood the position. One clear advance from Henry, and the pawn would fall. The rook would cut off the last escape. It would be clean, final. Henry saw it too. The line was direct, almost simple. He lifted the pawn instead of the rook, and held it suspended above the square that would begin the closing sequence. For a moment, the room seemed to narrow again, the hum of the refrigerator distant, the neon reduced to a faint vibration. He set the pawn back where it had been. Eli exhaled quietly, not in relief but in recognition. He moved his king one square sideways, into a place neither safer nor more dangerous than before. It was a move that preserved the tension without resolving it. The waitress approached their table at last. "We're closing," she said, her voice neutral. Henry nodded. He began placing the pieces into the box slowly, one by one. When he reached the metal rook, he turned it in his fingers as though weighing something unseen, then let it drop into the darkness with the others. They stepped outside together. The night had cooled. The factory chimney stood black and immovable against the sky. Eli walked toward his truck without speaking. Henry remained by the door a moment longer, listening to the quiet hum of the sign above him. Tomorrow, the board would be set again. The game would resume, not because it led anywhere, but because it kept them from arriving too soon. The next day began under a sky the color of worn aluminum. No rain, no promise. The blue note opened its door, as it always had, the bell giving its brief metallic complaint. Dust clung to the windows, despite the night wind. The highway moved steadily, indifferent to the town beside it. Henry arrived with a stiffness that had not been there before. He lowered himself into the chair and remained still for a moment, as if listening to something inside his own chest. The board lay flat on the table, waiting. He did not open the box immediately. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and watched the steam thin and disappear. Eli came later than usual. There was a pause at the door before he entered, a hesitation measured in seconds. He removed his cap and nodded once. Neither man mentioned the delay. Henry opened the box at last and poured the pieces onto the board with a muted wooden spill. They set them in place without speaking. The ritual was precise, almost careful. Pawns aligned first, then bishops, knights, the kings placed facing one another across the squares. Henry reached for the metal rook and found his hand lingering there longer than before. He positioned it in its corner and withdrew. The first moves were made without thought, familiar paths retraced. Outside, a pickup stalled briefly at the intersection before starting again. A dog barked somewhere beyond the fields. The town continued in small mechanical motions. Midway through the opening, Henry's hand faltered. A pawn slipped from his fingers and fell onto its side. The sound was sharper than expected. He did not reach to correct it at once. Eli looked up, then down again, as though nothing had happened. After a moment, Henry set the pawn upright and moved it forward one square. The game continued. The pieces advanced and retreated in measured silence. Nothing in the position suggested change. Yet something beneath it had shifted subtle, almost unnoticeable. Outside, the horizon remained flat and unbroken. Inside, wood touched wood with the same quiet certainty as before, holding two men in place against the slow erosion of time. The afternoon dragged itself across the windows in a dull sheet of light. Heat gathered under the ceiling and pressed downward, flattening the air. The blue note felt smaller than before, as though the walls had inched inward overnight. The board stood between them, pieces advancing into a position neither man hurried to define. Henry's movements had grown slower. He paused longer over each square, not calculating but resting. His fingers hovered above the metal rook, then drifted away. A thin tremor passed through his hand and was gone. He folded his hands together on the table as if steadying them. Eli noticed. He did not comment. He shifted a pawn forward and withdrew, giving Henry time without naming it. Outside, a tractor moved along the distant field, its engine low and patient. The factory chimney stood behind it, unchanged, an old witness to quiet decline. The game tightened, pawns locked in the center. The kings remained cautious, guarding narrow territories. Henry saw again the familiar line that would force the board open. He understood it as clearly as ever, yet clarity now felt separate from strength. He let the moment pass. The waitress refilled their cups. The sound of liquid against porcelain was brief and contained. She lingered half a second longer near Henry's shoulder, then moved away. The refrigerator hummed steadily, indifferent to hesitation. At last Henry advanced the metal rook, not decisively, but enough to alter the balance. The piece scraped softly across the square. Eli studied the new shape and answered without aggression. The board did not collapse. It held. Outside, the sky dimmed toward evening again. Inside, the pieces remained upright. The game continued, sustained less by competition than by the quiet agreement not to let the table fall empty. Evening settled heavier than usual. The air inside the blue note felt used, as though it had already lived through the day once before. Outside, the neon sign flickered with a faint, irregular pulse, its blue light thinning and swelling against the darkening glass. The highway had quieted early. Even the trucks seemed to pass at a distance. The board stood in a late position again. Pawns reduced. Kings cautious. The metal rook placed near the center, no longer confined to its corner. Henry's hand rested beside it, not touching, but close enough to feel its presence. His breathing had grown slower, more deliberate. Each inhale carried a slight effort. Eli leaned forward, elbows on the table. He studied Henry rather than the squares. The lines around Henry's eyes had deepened, not from calculation, but from strain. Eli shifted his gaze back to the board and moved a pawn, a modest step that neither threatened nor surrendered. It was an offering of time. Henry nodded faintly and reached for his cup. It was empty. He set it down without calling for more. The waitress watched from behind the counter, but did not approach. Some distances are measured without steps. The position before them had narrowed to something clean. One careful sequence would force Eli's king toward the edge. Henry saw it at once. His fingers closed around the metal rook. The weight of it felt undeniable now, cool, solid, honest. He lifted it, held it suspended over the square that would begin the end. For a long second, nothing moved. The neon hummed. The refrigerator answered. Outside, the wind pressed lightly against the door. Then Henry set the rook down not on the decisive square, but beside it. A compromise, a postponement. Eli's shoulders eased, barely perceptible. He answered by shifting his king into the open, vulnerable, yet unafraid. The board settled into a quiet balance once more. Night gathered fully beyond the glass. Inside, under the thin light, two men remained seated, guarding not victory, but the fragile continuity of another unfinished game. Integration of quiet. The espresso machine growled in the kitchen like a small offended animal. It did not forgive neglect, and neither did the morning. Ryan stood in front of it in his white shirt, sleeves already buttoned, watching the dark liquid gather in the cup. He did not add sugar. The bitterness helped him measure the day. Across the Marble Island, Vivian checked her phone. Her movements were exact, almost surgical. The scent of her perfume hung in the air clean, metallic, without warmth. They did not speak. Words at this hour would have required intention. The elevator to the 44th floor was lined with mirrors. They stood side by side, their shoulders nearly touching, yet they looked only at the numbers glowing above the door. 23, 31, 40. The ascent was smooth, indifferent. In the reflection, Ryan noticed the outline of his own face and found nothing there to read. Vivian adjusted her glasses without glancing at him. The gesture was precise, economical. When the doors opened, they stepped out at the same time, like colleagues arriving for a meeting neither of them had called. The office was already breathing. The air conditioner produced a steady, low hum that filled the rooms before any human voice could. The temperature never changed. Through the wide windows, Fifth Avenue lay far below, reduced to geometry and light. The skyscrapers across from them looked arranged, almost artificial, like pieces on a board no one dared to touch. On Ryan's desk, there was only a laptop and a clean ashtray. No one smoked anymore. The ashtray remained, an object without function, polished to a dull shine. Invoices whispered as they moved from one pair of hands to another. Paper was their last physical contact. Vivian's gaze passed over Ryan, as if he were made of reinforced glass present, but not obstructing. At noon they opened identical plastic containers. Salad leaves pressed against transparent walls. The forks struck the sides with small, hollow sounds. A phone rang. Ryan answered. The voice on the other end demanded attention with a confidence he could not remember possessing. When he ended the call, the silence returned at once, heavier than before. In the glass partition, Ryan caught his reflection again. For a moment, he had the strange sensation of seeing a man who had forgotten his own name. He opened a drawer and found an old Zippo lighter he had not touched in years. It still smelled faintly of fuel, of roads that had not yet been paved with obligations. He closed the drawer carefully. At 5, the office emptied around them. Neon light replaced daylight. Until tomorrow, Vivian said as she gathered her things. It was not a promise. It was a fact. Outside, their cars disappeared into separate streams of red, and the city resumed its steady, vertical stillness. The next morning, the machine growled again. It was always the same sound, the same measured violence before the coffee settled into the cup. Ryan watched the steam rise and vanish. He tried to remember when mornings had felt like beginnings instead of repetitions. Across the counter, Vivian fastened the thin bracelet on her wrist. The clasp clicked shut with a small metallic certainty. She did not look up. Outside, the city was already moving, but from the 44th floor, it appeared muted, rehearsed. In the elevator, a young analyst joined them, carrying a leather folder too large for his hands. He spoke about a merger, as if it were whether inevitable, neutral. Ryan nodded without listening. Vivian's reflection remained composed, her eyes fixed on the numbers climbing toward their assigned altitude. When the doors opened, the young man stepped out first. His shoes made confident sounds against the polished floor. Ryan felt the faint urge to follow someone else's direction, but the hallway offered only their office and its conditioned air. On his desk lay a new stack of contracts. The paper was thick, expensive. He lifted the top sheet and smelled ink. Vivian moved behind him, precise as always. "They want the signatures by noon," she said. Her voice carried no strain. He signed where the markers indicated. The pen moved smoothly, obedient to his hand. For a second, he imagined refusing, leaving the line blank, but the thought dissolved before it formed into action. Near the window, a single bird drifted between the buildings, unstable in the crosscurrents. Ryan watched it circle and disappear. The sky above Fifth Avenue was an indifferent blue, too clean to belong to anything alive. Behind him, Vivian hesitated before placing her name on the final page. Her fingers trembled, barely visible, a flaw in the steel. She steadied them at once and finished the motion. The sound of her pen touching paper was soft, final. At 5, the office lights reflected off the glass walls until they seemed enclosed in a box of their own making. Ryan opened the window a fraction. For the first time in months, unfiltered air entered the room, dust, exhaust, a distant siren. Vivian looked at him, but did not protest. The noise from below rose like an accusation. He almost said something about the lighter in the drawer, about roads that had not yet narrowed into corridors, but the sentence stopped midway. They stood there, listening to the city breathe, aware that nothing inside them moved with it. Rain began before noon. At first, it appeared only as a distortion on the glass, a faint trembling of the skyline. From the 44th floor, the drops made no sound. They simply altered the city's shape, bending steel and concrete into wavering lines. Ryan stood by the window, longer than necessary. The streets below turned dark, reflective. Cars moved through their own blurred shadows. Inside, the air conditioner continued its steady hum, indifferent to weather. Vivian removed her glasses and wiped them with a folded tissue. Without them, her face seemed less guarded, almost unfinished. For a moment, her eyes were unfocused, softer. Then she put the glasses back on, and the steel returned. "The board is satisfied," she said, placing a folder on his desk. The paper slid across the surface without friction. Ryan nodded. Satisfaction was a word that had lost dimension. It described outcomes, not feelings. In the drawer, the Zippo lay where he had left it. He took it out and turned it in his hand. The metal was scratched, dulled by years he no longer mentioned. When he flicked it open, the sound was small but precise. No flame followed. He had emptied it long ago. Still, the faint smell of fuel rose up an echo of motels and long highways, of wind entering through half-open windows. He closed it again before Vivian could notice. At lunch, the rain thickened. Water streamed down the glass in heavy lines, erasing the geometry of Fifth Avenue. They ate from their plastic containers without appetite. A drop of coffee fell from Ryan's cup onto his cuff, spreading into the white fabric like a quiet accusation. He stared at it longer than necessary. Vivian's eyes lifted toward him, then toward the stain. Neither of them spoke. The mark remained, small but undeniable. When evening came, the office emptied more quickly than usual. The storm had driven people home. Ryan switched off his monitor, and the room softened at once. In the dim light, Vivian's silhouette seemed less exact, almost human. Their eyes met over the rim of her cup 5 seconds that stretched without promise. "We should," he began, though he did not know the ending. The words dissolved between them. Outside, the rain continued to fall, patient and without intention. The storm passed during the night, leaving the city rinsed and colorless. Morning light entered the apartment without warmth. The espresso machine made its familiar protest. Ryan waited for the cup to fill, listening to the short, angry breaths of steam. Vivian stood by the window, fastening the last button of her blouse. The sky over Fifth Avenue was pale and exhausted. "Traffic will be slow," she said, not turning. It was the closest they came to concern. In the elevator, the mirrors showed 2 versions of the same ascent. Their reflections did not quite align with their bodies. Ryan studied the faint lines at the corners of his mouth. He could not remember when they had settled there permanently. Vivian's gaze remained fixed on the illuminated numbers. 36, 37. The ride felt longer than usual, though the mechanism moved at its usual speed. At the office, The smell of damp concrete drifted faintly through the ventilation. Someone had left a window open in another suite. The air conditioner struggled against the intrusion, producing a harsher hum. On Ryan's desk, a courier envelope waited. He slid it open with a letter opener and unfolded the contents without curiosity. Another acquisition. Another expansion of territory. Neither of them would ever walk. Vivian stood at the conference table reviewing projections. Her hand paused above a column of figures. For a second, her shoulders lowered, as if something invisible had pressed down on them. Ryan watched from the doorway. He noticed the small pulse at her temple, quick and stubborn. "It's efficient," she said finally, though he had not asked. Efficiency was their last shared language. That evening, the building emptied early. The rain had washed the sidewalks clean, and the city seemed briefly unguarded. Ryan stepped onto the balcony outside their office. The air carried a trace of wet asphalt. Vivian joined him without speaking. Below, headlights moved in disciplined lines. He reached into his pocket and felt the cold shape of the Zippo. He did not take it out. "Until tomorrow," she said again, her voice even. They parted in the lobby, their footsteps fading in opposite directions, as if distance were the only movement left to them. On Friday, the light arrived thin and metallic, as if filtered through sheets of steel. The espresso machine hesitated before producing its usual growl. Ryan waited with his hand resting on the counter. For a moment, he imagined leaving the cup untouched, walking out before the coffee finished pouring. The thought felt larger than he was prepared to carry. Vivian adjusted the collar of her coat and checked the time. "We're expected early," she said. He nodded. Expectation had replaced desire long ago. The elevator was empty except for them. In the mirrored walls, their distance seemed exaggerated, widened by reflection. Ryan watched the numbers climb and felt a faint pressure behind his ribs. Not pain, not quite. Vivian's perfume filled the enclosed space, clean and exact. He wondered whether she noticed the silence between them, or whether it had become as normal as the ascent itself. When the doors opened, they stepped out without touching. At his desk, the ashtray caught the morning light. Its surface was immaculate, useless. Ryan opened the drawer and took out the Zippo once more. He weighed it in his palm. The metal felt colder than usual. He struck it open and closed, the sound precise and hollow. Across the room, Vivian spoke into her headset, her tone controlled, decisive. The voice she used for others was steady, almost warm. It did not belong to the space between them. Around noon, a faint vibration passed through the building construction from a lower floor. The tremor was slight but persistent, enough to unsettle the glasses in the cabinet. Vivian paused mid-sentence and looked toward the window. For an instant, her expression emptied, as if something essential had slipped out of alignment. Ryan met her gaze. There was no accusation there, only fatigue. He felt the sudden urge to say her name without purpose, simply to confirm it still held meaning. He remained silent. At 5, the week folded into itself. Monitors darkened one by one, leaving the office in a muted gray. Ryan switched off the overhead lights, and the room softened. On the balcony, the evening air carried a faint chill. They stood side by side, not touching, watching the traffic thread through Fifth Avenue. Vivian removed her glasses and pressed her fingers briefly to the bridge of her nose. "See you Monday," she said. The words hung between them, heavier than usual. Ryan stayed a moment longer after she left, listening to the city's distant pulse, aware that endurance had quietly replaced hope. Monday returned without announcement. The apartment was quiet, except for the low hiss of steam and the brief, irritated growl of the espresso machine. Ryan watched the dark liquid settle and felt a faint resistance in his hands, as if the cup weighed more than before. Vivian stood at the counter, reviewing messages on her phone. The light from the screen sharpened her features. "There's a meeting at 9, she said. He nodded. The week had already begun, without asking them. The elevator paused on the 12th floor to admit a cleaning woman with a cart. She smelled faintly of soap and fatigue. For a moment, the enclosed space felt human. Ryan stepped aside to let her pass. Vivian thanked her with a small, efficient smile. When the woman exited, silence closed again, polished and complete. The numbers continued their ascent. 42, 43. The mechanism did not hesitate. On the 44th floor, the corridor lights flickered once before stabilizing. Inside the office, the air conditioner resumed its steady hum. A thin crack had appeared in the corner of the glass partition, almost invisible unless the light struck it directly. Ryan noticed it while removing his coat. The fracture ran diagonally, delicate but undeniable. He touched the surface lightly. The glass held. Vivian followed his gaze, but said nothing. The meeting passed in measured tones. Charts glowed on the screen. Profit margins rose in clean lines. Ryan spoke when required, his voice level. Vivian's comments were precise, leaving no space for doubt. When the others filed out, carrying their folders like shields, the room felt abruptly hollow. Through the window, Fifth Avenue moved in disciplined patterns. The crack in the glass caught a thread of sunlight and held it. Near dusk, a power fluctuation dimmed the lights for a fraction of a second. The monitors blinked but remained alive. In that brief shadow, the room seemed less defined. Vivian exhaled slowly and removed her glasses. Without them, her eyes appeared tired, almost uncertain. Ryan considered mentioning the crack, the flicker, the small signs of imperfection. Instead, he said, "It's colder today." She nodded. They left together, but descended in silence, carrying the day like an object that had no place to be set down. Tuesday arrived with a dry wind that pressed against the windows high above Fifth Avenue. The espresso machine functioned without protest, as if it had accepted its role. Ryan drank the coffee too quickly and felt the heat settle in his chest. Vivian stood at the sink rinsing her cup, though it was already clean. Water ran in a narrow, disciplined stream. "The auditors are coming," she said. Her tone suggested weather, again predictable, unavoidable. In the elevator, a faint scent of metal lingered from the weekend maintenance. Ryan watched the doors close on the lobby's polished marble. For a second, he imagined not pressing the button, remaining between floors where nothing was required. Vivian's reflection remained composed, almost severe. When the cabin shuddered slightly before resuming its ascent, neither of them reacted. Movement, even imperfect, was still movement. The auditors arrived in dark suits, carrying laptops and quiet suspicion. Papers moved across the conference table in careful stacks. Ryan answered questions with practiced clarity. Vivian corrected a figure without looking at her notes. The air conditioner worked harder under the weight of bodies and expectation. At one point, a glass of water tipped and spilled across the table, spreading toward the contracts. Everyone froze. Ryan placed his hand over the pages, absorbing the moisture with his sleeve. The damage was minimal. The meeting continued. After they left, the office seemed larger, almost exposed. The crack in the glass partition had lengthened by a fraction, thin as a hair. Ryan traced it again with his eyes. Vivian stood beside him. "It's only cosmetic," she said quietly. He nodded. Cosmetic damage could remain for years without consequence. Through the window, the wind bent the traffic lights slightly out of alignment. At dusk, they stepped onto the balcony. The wind moved between the buildings, lifting loose papers from a distant desk below. Vivian held the railing, her fingers pale against the metal. Ryan felt the old lighter in his pocket and did not remove it. "We're still here," he said, unsure whether it was a question or a statement. Vivian looked out at the city's vertical lines and answered after a pause. Yes, the word carried no relief. They went back inside, closing the door carefully against the wind. Wednesday carried a thin brightness, almost clinical. The espresso machine functioned with mechanical obedience. Ryan noticed the absence of its earlier growl. Even the small resistance had disappeared. Vivian stood by the counter, fastening her watch. The gesture was precise, final. Neither mentioned the auditors. Neither mentioned the crack in the glass. Silence had become a method of preservation. The elevator was crowded that morning. 2 junior associates discussed numbers in hushed excitement. Their optimism rose like heat. Ryan stood between them and Vivian, staring at his reflection, fractured by other shoulders. For a moment, he could not immediately locate himself in the mirror. The doors opened on the 44th floor, and the younger voices spilled out ahead of them, bright and temporary. Inside the office, the crack had grown. It reached now from the corner of the partition toward the center, a faint white vein through the transparency. The maintenance department had left a small sticker near it, scheduled inspection. Ryan read it twice. Vivian removed her glasses and studied the fracture without comment. "It's under control," she said at last. He wondered who exactly controlled it. By afternoon, the sky turned pale and distant. A helicopter hovered between buildings, its shadow sliding briefly across the windows. The hum of its blades disturbed the steady rhythm of the air conditioner. Ryan felt the vibration in his bones. Vivian's pen paused mid-signature. For an instant, their eyes met, not over a cup or a document, but simply in shared interruption. The helicopter moved on. The hum returned to normal. That evening, they left the office later than usual. The corridor lights flickered again before stabilizing. On the balcony, the air felt thinner, sharper. Traffic below moved in disciplined currents, red and white lines stretching into darkness. Ryan rested his hands on the railing and sensed its cold solidity. Vivian stood beside him without touching. "It won't last forever," he said quietly, unsure whether he meant the crack, the building, or the stillness between them. Vivian did not ask. "No," she replied. The word remained suspended in the vertical night as they turned back inside. Thursday began without light. A low ceiling of clouds pressed against the city, turning the windows into dull sheets of gray. The espresso machine worked in silence now, as if even it had grown tired of protest. Ryan drank his coffee standing. Vivian tied her hair back with a narrow black band. A gesture exposed the pale line of her neck. Neither of them mentioned the weather. It entered the room anyway. In the elevator, the lights flickered once and steadied. No one else joined them. The mirrored walls reflected 2 figures, slightly blurred by the dimness. Ryan watched the numbers ascend and felt the faint sensation of rising without progress. Vivian's eyes remained fixed forward. When the doors opened, the corridor seemed longer than usual, stretched by the lack of sun. The crack in the glass partition had reached the center. It divided the room into 2 unequal halves. A technician stood examining it, tapping gently near the edge. "Stress?" he said. "Temperature changes." His voice was casual, almost apologetic. Ryan nodded. Vivian signed the inspection form without reading it. The technician left, promising repair by next week. The crack remained. Work proceeded with disciplined calm. Emails arrived. Contracts were approved. The air conditioner hummed as it always had, though the room felt colder. Around midday, the clouds broke briefly, and a narrow blade of sunlight cut through the office, striking the fracture. For a second, the crack shone bright and unmistakable. Vivian stood motionless in the light, her face unguarded. Ryan saw the faint lines beneath her eyes, the fatigue she never acknowledged. The light faded. At 5, the office emptied again. They remained seated at opposite ends of the conference table. The city below had begun to glow with evening signals. Ryan closed his laptop slowly. "We could leave early tomorrow," he said, not specifying from what. Vivian considered the suggestion as if it required calculation. "There's nothing waiting," she answered. He did not argue. They descended together in the dim elevator, their reflections divided by shadow, carrying the day like a quiet confirmation of the vertical stillness above Fifth Avenue. Friday returned with a washed-out sky and a brittle clarity that made every edge appear sharper than it was. The espresso machine no longer growled. It released the coffee in a thin, obedient stream, as if it had accepted its own redundancy. Ryan held the cup, but did not drink immediately. Vivian stood near the window, already dressed for the day, her posture exact. "The repair team comes Monday," she said. He nodded. The crack had been given a schedule. In the elevator, they descended first to the lobby for a brief meeting before rising again. The motion felt circular, unnecessary. Mirrors reflected them from all sides. Ryan noticed how easily their images multiplied, how none of them seemed more substantial than the others. Vivian's gaze did not search for him anymore. It remained steady, forward-facing. The elevator hummed with quiet precision. The office was almost empty when they arrived. Many had chosen to work remotely. The crack in the glass partition now divided the room clearly, a pale line separating desk from desk. Ryan stood before it and saw his reflection fractured. He lifted his hand and placed it lightly against the surface. The glass was cold and unyielding. Vivian watched him without comment. "It's temporary," she said. He was not certain what she meant. Near noon, a faint tremor passed through the building construction, perhaps, or the distant subway. The crack extended by a fraction, almost imperceptibly, but enough. A thin sound followed, like a quiet breath escaping. Neither moved. The office remained intact. The skyline beyond the window stood unchanged, disciplined and vertical. Ryan lowered his hand. When evening came, they did not stay on the balcony. The air outside carried a sharper chill. Instead, they stood by the window, looking down at the red lines of traffic threading through Fifth Avenue. "Until Monday," Vivian said, her voice even. It sounded less like habit and more like resignation. Ryan watched her reflection in the fractured glass as she turned away. After she left, he remained a moment longer, studying the divided image of himself, aware that the crack required no immediate repair to alter what it separated. Monday arrived with a pale, indifferent sun. The espresso machine released its thin stream of coffee without resistance. Ryan stood in the kitchen longer than necessary, listening for a sound that no longer came. Vivian was already dressed, reviewing a message on her phone. "They'll replace the panel this afternoon," she said. He nodded. Replacement implied restoration. He was not certain the two were the same. In the elevator, the cabin felt smaller. A delivery man entered at the lobby carrying a narrow crate marked fragile. He avoided eye contact. The word lingered in the mirrored walls. Ryan watched the reflection of the crate as it multiplied, each image identical and vulnerable. Vivian's expression remained composed. When the doors opened on the 44th floor, the delivery man stepped out first, guided by someone from maintenance. The office smelled faintly of new glass. The cracked partition had been removed. In its place stood a flawless, seamless pane, transparent and complete. The line that had divided the room was gone. Ryan approached it cautiously, searching for the faint white vein that had marked the days. There was nothing. His reflection returned whole, unbroken, but unfamiliar. Vivian ran her fingers lightly along the edge of the frame. "Better," she said. Work resumed at once, as if interruption had been a minor inconvenience. Emails, projections, calls. The air conditioner hummed with renewed confidence. Through the window, Fifth Avenue shimmered in precise alignment. At midday, a bird passed between buildings, its path erratic, brief. Ryan watched it until it disappeared. He felt no impulse to open the window. At dusk, the office lights dimmed in their usual sequence. The new glass caught the neon from across the street and reflected it cleanly. Vivian gathered her things. "Until tomorrow," she said, as always. Ryan looked once more at the flawless partition. The fracture had vanished, but the memory of it remained, faint and persistent. When he turned off the last light, the room darkened evenly, without division. Outside, the city continued its vertical ascent, intact and indifferent. Tuesday unfolded with a clarity that felt almost rehearsed. The espresso machine released its measured breath. The coffee gathered in the cup without sound. Ryan drank it standing by the window. The sky above Fifth Avenue was a pale, disciplined blue. Vivian adjusted her watch and checked the time twice, as if confirming that it still moved forward. "We're presenting at 10, she said. He nodded. Presentation required surface, not depth. The elevator carried them upward in polished silence. The mirrors returned their images intact now, without fracture. Ryan searched unconsciously for distortion and found none. Vivian's reflection was composed, complete. When the doors opened, the corridor lights glowed steadily. The building had corrected itself. In the conference room, the new glass partition shone without imperfection. Charts appeared on the screen, clean lines rising with quiet assurance. Ryan spoke in even sentences, describing projections that extended years ahead. Vivian followed with precise numbers, her tone steady and confident. The room listened. Applause was brief, restrained. Success had become routine. After the meeting, the office emptied again. Through the flawless paying, Ryan saw himself reflected beside Vivian. Two figures standing close, yet separated by transparency. He touched the glass lightly. It gave back only cold resistance. "It holds," Vivian said. He was not sure whether she referred to the building or to them. Evening descended in narrow bands of light. The city below moved with habitual discipline. Ryan remained by the window as Vivian gathered her things. "Tomorrow," she said, not looking back. The word felt identical to yesterday's, yet heavier. When he finally turned off the lights, the reflection in the glass disappeared completely, leaving only the city outside, precise, vertical, and without need of repair. Wednesday brought heat. It rose from the pavement and reached even the 44th floor, dulling the edges of the skyline. The espresso machine released its quiet breath. Ryan did not wait for the cup to fill completely. He left a thin remainder at the bottom, as if something unfinished might alter the day. Vivian stood at the counter, reading an email twice before answering. "The expansion is approved," she said. He nodded. Approval required no celebration. In the elevator, the air felt heavier than usual. A faint scent of overheated wiring lingered, though the lights remained steady. Ryan watched the reflections climb with the numbers. The mirrored walls returned them whole, unchanged. He searched again for the memory of a fracture and found only smooth surfaces. Vivian's eyes remained forward, disciplined. At the office, the new glass partition gleamed without flaw. A faint smear from cleaning solution traced along its edge, already drying. Ryan placed his palm against it and felt nothing but cool resistance. Beyond the pane, his desk waited with its measured order. Laptop, ashtray, aligned papers. Vivian removed her glasses and pressed her fingers briefly to her eyes before returning them to their place. The gesture lasted only a second. By afternoon, the heat thickened. The air conditioner hummed at a higher pitch, fighting an invisible pressure. Outside, the traffic on Fifth Avenue slowed, compressed into tighter lines. A siren wailed somewhere below, distant but persistent. Ryan stood at the window and watched the red lights pulse in the haze. He imagined the crack returning, a thin white vein splitting the glass again. It did not. At dusk, they remained seated longer than usual. The room felt suspended, neither cooled nor entirely warm. Vivian closed her laptop carefully. "It's temporary," she said quietly, though there was no visible damage left to reference. Ryan looked at the seamless pane dividing the office and understood she meant something less precise. "Yes," he replied. They left together, descending through mirrored walls that offered no fracture, only repetition. Outside, the city held its vertical posture, indifferent to heat and memory alike. Thursday arrived with a thin fog that blurred the edges of the skyline. From the kitchen window, the towers looked less certain, as if drawn in pencil and lightly smudged. The espresso machine released its quiet breath. Ryan listened, waiting for some irregularity, but the sound remained obedient. Vivian stood by the door, fastening her coat despite the warmth. "There's a review at 4, she said. He nodded. Reviews measured continuity, not change. The elevator climbed through the fog-shrouded building, its mirrored walls reflecting only dim shapes. Ryan noticed how easily their outlines dissolved in the softened light. Vivian's face appeared less defined, the steel in her eyes muted by gray. For a moment, he considered speaking her name, simply to test its weight in the air. The doors opened before he could decide. In the office, the new glass partition seemed almost invisible against the fog outside. Without the fracture, there was nothing to interrupt the view. Ryan stood at his desk and watched the blurred city below. The ashtray caught a pale reflection and gave nothing back. Vivian moved between table and window with her usual precision, though her steps were quieter than before. At 4, the review concluded without incident. Numbers aligned, projections satisfied. Applause was brief and measured. When the others left, the room settled into its familiar hum. The fog outside thickened, pressing against the windows like a restrained force. Ryan opened the balcony door slightly. Cool, damp air entered, carrying the distant echo of traffic. Vivian did not object. They stood side by side, looking into the gray. The city's vertical lines dissolved into suggestion. "It's easier not to see everything," Vivian said after a moment. Her voice lacked its usual steel. Ryan felt the lighter in his pocket, but did not reach for it. "Yes," he answered. They closed the door carefully and turned off the lights. In the dim reflection of the flawless glass, their figures appeared briefly and then vanished, leaving only the fog suspended over Fifth Avenue. Friday came with sudden clarity. The fog had lifted during the night, leaving the city exposed and sharply outlined. From the kitchen window, the tower stood rigid and precise. The espresso machine exhaled its measured breath. Ryan poured the coffee and did not taste it. Vivian stood by the table, her coat folded over her arm. "It's the end of the quarter," she said. He nodded. Endings were administrative. In the elevator, sunlight struck the mirrored walls and returned their images with unforgiving detail. Ryan saw the faint fatigue beneath his eyes. Vivian's posture remained exact, but her shoulders seemed lower than before. The numbers climbed. 42, 43. The cabin reached their floor with its usual quiet certainty. The office felt unusually bright. The new glass partition reflected the skyline without interruption. Ryan paused before it, studying the seamless surface. He tried to remember the precise path of the old crack and found only an outline in memory. Vivian placed a folder on the table and began outlining the next quarter strategy. Her voice was calm, decisive. It filled the room efficiently. By afternoon, the work was finished. The quarter closed in clean lines. Emails were sent, confirmations received. The air conditioner hummed in steady approval. Outside, traffic moved in disciplined currents, red lights stretching toward the horizon. Ryan stood at the window longer than necessary. He felt the weight of the lighter in his pocket, but did not remove it. When evening settled, they turned off the monitors one by one. The room darkened evenly, without fracture or shadow. On the balcony, the air was cool and exact. Vivian rested her hands on the railing, looking down at Fifth Avenue. "Until Monday," she said. The words sounded final, though they were not. Ryan watched her reflection in the flawless glass behind them. It remained whole, unbroken. He understood then that absence of fracture did not mean absence of division. They left separately, their taillights merging into the steady vertical rhythm of the city. Monday arrived without resistance. The weekend had passed like a closed door, no sound, no interruption. The espresso machine released its thin, obedient stream. Ryan watched the coffee rise and stop. Vivian stood by the counter, already composed, scrolling through messages. "The acquisition goes public today," she said. He nodded. Public announcements altered nothing inside rooms like theirs. The elevator carried them upward with its familiar restraint. A faint vibration ran through the cabin, subtle but continuous. Ryan placed his hand lightly against the mirrored wall, feeling the tremor beneath the polished surface. Vivian did not react. Her reflection remained still, precise. The numbers climbed without hesitation. The office was brighter than usual. Screens glowed with headlines repeating their names in disciplined fonts. The new glass partition reflected the movement of light cleanly. No crack interrupted the view. Ryan read the announcement once and closed the window on his screen. Vivian fielded calls in a voice that carried quiet authority. Congratulations arrived in measured tones. Near midday, the vibration returned, this time stronger. It traveled through the floor, through the glass, through the polished desk. A truck, perhaps, or distant construction. The partition shivered almost imperceptibly. Ryan's gaze fixed on its flawless surface. For a fraction of a second, he imagined a white line reappearing, dividing the room once more. The glass held. Vivian ended her call and looked at him. Neither spoke. By evening, the headlines had settled into routine. The office lights reflected evenly in the seamless pane. Ryan stood at the window, watching Fifth Avenue absorb the news without pause. Traffic moved in disciplined lines, indifferent to announcements or tremors. Vivian gathered her coat. "It changes nothing," she said quietly. Ryan felt the lighter in his pocket, the cold shape pressing against fabric. "No," he replied. They left together, descending through mirrored walls that offered only repetition, while the city continued its vertical ascent without noticing their silence. Tuesday carried a dry, unremarkable light. The espresso machine performed its task without sound. Ryan drank the coffee slowly this time, as if duration itself could alter its taste. Vivian stood near the window, fastening a thin silver chain at her throat. The metal caught the morning light and held it briefly. "There's an interview at 11, she said. He nodded. Exposure was part of continuity. In the elevator, a journalist joined them, young, alert, holding a recorder like a small instrument. He smiled too quickly. Ryan watched their reflections multiply in the mirrored walls. The journalist spoke about vision, about growth, about trajectory. Vivian answered with precise phrases, polished and intact. The numbers climbed. The cabin opened. The journalist stepped out ahead of them, already rehearsing his questions. The interview took place beside the flawless glass partition. Cameras captured the skyline beyond, framing success against disciplined architecture. Ryan spoke in even sentences. Vivian completed them when necessary. Their words moved without friction. When the journalist asked about partnership, Ryan glanced briefly at Vivian. Her expression did not change. "Alignment," she said. The word remained suspended between them. After the cameras left, the office seemed larger and quieter. Ryan stood before the glass partition and searched for any sign of imperfection. The surface reflected him whole. He tried to remember the sound the crack had made when it lengthened. The memory was faint. Vivian removed her glasses and pressed her fingers to her temple, then replaced them as if sealing something back in place. That evening, the city glowed with restrained intensity. Traffic lights traced red lines through the descending dark. Ryan stepped onto the balcony alone. The air felt thinner than usual. He took the Zippo from his pocket and opened it. The metal clicked sharply in the quiet. There was still no fuel, no flame. He closed it and returned it to his pocket. Inside, Vivian was turning off the lights. "Tomorrow," she said. The word echoed without promise as the room darkened evenly around them. Wednesday began with rain again, though lighter than before. The drops traced careful paths down the windows, distorting the skyline without erasing it. The espresso machine functioned in its quiet obedience. Ryan watched the water on the glass longer than the coffee in his cup. Vivian stood near the door, fastening her coat despite the mild air. "The markets are unsettled," she said. He nodded. Unsettled did not mean collapse. The elevator carried them upward through the damp morning. A faint smell of wet concrete drifted in from the lobby. Ryan studied their reflections, two figures rising without visible strain. Vivian's eyes remained forward, disciplined. The numbers reached 44 with their usual restraint. The doors opened to the steady hum of conditioned air. In the office, a flawless partition stood untouched by rain. Water distorted the city beyond, but the glass remained seamless. Ryan ran his hand lightly along its surface, as if verifying its stability. Vivian reviewed reports at the conference table, her movements exact. The room felt smaller in the gray light. Near noon, thunder rolled faintly across the city. The building absorbed the sound with little reaction. A brief flicker dimmed the monitors, then restored them. Ryan's gaze moved instinctively to the partition. It did not shiver. Vivian paused, her pen suspended midair. For a second, uncertainty crossed her face. Not steel, not clarity, simply fatigue. Then the moment passed. At dusk, the rain had stopped. The streets below reflected the red of traffic lights in elongated streaks. Ryan and Vivian stood by the window without speaking. The city seemed blurred, but intact. "It holds," Vivian said quietly, though nothing had tested it beyond weather. Ryan looked at the seamless glass and felt the absence of fracture more sharply than its presence had ever felt. They left together, descending in silence, while the city resumed its vertical rhythm without noticing their quiet endurance. Thursday opened with a hard, colorless light. The rain had washed the air clean, leaving the skyline exposed and exact. The espresso machine released its thin stream without protest. Ryan drank standing, his eyes on the window. Vivian reviewed her calendar at the table, crossing out a meeting that had been canceled. "They postponed the signing," she said. He nodded. Postponement felt indistinguishable from progress. The elevator rose with its familiar restraint. No one joined them. In the mirrored walls, their reflections stood side by side, intact and distant. Ryan noticed how easily the cabin contained them, how nothing inside it required explanation. Vivian's posture remained precise, though her hands were clasped more tightly than usual. The office was unusually quiet. Several desks stood empty. The flawless glass partition reflected the vacant chairs, doubling their absence. Ryan walked to the window and looked down at Fifth Avenue. Traffic moved in disciplined currents, unaffected by cancellations or delays. Vivian placed a folder on his desk and did not open it. "It can wait," she said. The words lingered. In the afternoon, sunlight struck the partition directly. For a moment, a faint internal line appeared, no crack, only a subtle distortion in the reflection. Ryan leaned closer. It vanished as quickly as it had formed. Vivian watched him without speaking. The air conditioner hummed steadily, filling the room with controlled sound. Evening descended with abrupt clarity. The city below glowed in red and white threads. Ryan switched off his monitor and stood beside Vivian at the window. Neither touched the glass. "It's stable," she said quietly. He understood she meant the building, the company, perhaps even them. "Yes," he answered. They left in silence, descending through mirrored walls that offered no fracture, only repetition, while the vertical stillness above Fifth Avenue remained intact. Friday arrived with a wind that moved between the towers and pressed lightly against the windows. The espresso machine released its narrow stream as it always did. Ryan stood in the kitchen longer than necessary, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the small mechanical assurances of a contained life. Vivian buttoned her coat without looking at him. They confirmed Monday, she said. He did not ask what had been confirmed. It no longer mattered which agreement required their names. In the elevator, a brief hesitation interrupted the ascent. The cabin paused between floors, suspended in polished silence. The lights remained steady. Ryan felt the stillness settle in his chest, almost welcome. Vivian stood motionless, her gaze fixed forward. After a few seconds, the mechanism resumed. The numbers continued their climb, as if nothing had occurred. The office was bright with unfiltered sun. The flawless partition reflected the skyline sharply. Ryan approached it slowly and studied his reflection. No fracture, no distortion. Only a complete image returning his gaze. Vivian set her bag on the table and removed her glasses, cleaning lenses that were already clear. "It's efficient," she said, as if offering reassurance. He nodded. Efficiency required no warmth. By afternoon, the wind strengthened. Papers near the window shifted slightly despite the closed glass. Ryan opened the balcony door a fraction. Air entered in a controlled rush, carrying the distant pulse of traffic and a faint scent of metal. Vivian stepped beside him. For a moment, neither spoke. The city below held its vertical order. When evening settled, they turned off the lights together. The office darkened evenly, the partition reflecting only faint traces of neon from across the street. "Until Monday," Vivian said, her voice steady. Ryan felt the weight of the lighter in his pocket, but left it untouched. They descended through mirrored walls that returned them whole and silent. Outside, their cars merged into the disciplined flow of Fifth Avenue, while the building above remained intact, unfractured, and indifferent. Monday began with a sharp blue sky, too clear to be comforting. The espresso machine performed its quiet ritual. Ryan watched the coffee gather and felt a dull pressure behind his ribs, neither pain nor relief. Vivian stood near the window, reading a message twice before deleting it. "They moved it up," she said. 9 instead of 11. He nodded. Time could be shifted without changing its weight. In the elevator, the ascent felt smoother than usual, almost silent. The mirrored walls reflected them cleanly, without distortion. Ryan studied his own face and found it steady, unreadable. Vivian's posture remained exact, her hands resting lightly against her coat. The numbers climbed. 44. The office waited with its disciplined calm. The glass partition stood flawless, dividing nothing visibly. Ryan paused before it, half expecting some hidden line to reveal itself under the morning light. There was none. The city beyond shimmered in ordered geometry. Vivian set her folder on the conference table and began outlining the meeting's structure in measured sentences. At 9, the room filled with quiet authority. Agreements were discussed, conditions refined. Ryan spoke when required, his voice level and precise. Vivian completed the final terms without hesitation. Pens moved across paper. Signatures appeared in confident strokes. Applause was brief and controlled. The acquisition was formal now, no longer projection but fact. By evening, the office had emptied. The monitors were dark. Ryan stood at the window, watching the disciplined currents of Fifth Avenue. Vivian approached the flawless partition and touched it lightly, as if confirming its solidity. "It's done," she said. The words contained no triumph. Ryan nodded. Done implied completion, not resolution. They turned off the lights and left together, descending in silence while the building above them remained intact, seamless, and perfectly vertical. Tuesday arrived without announcement. The sky was a pale, indifferent gray, neither threatening nor clear. The espresso machine released its thin stream. Ryan did not wait for the cup to fill. He switched it off midway and watched the remaining drops fall in uneven intervals. Vivian stood by the counter reading headlines that repeated yesterday's announcement in smaller fonts. "It's already old news," she said. He nodded. Even completion expired quickly. The elevator rose with its usual restraint. A faint metallic echo followed the closing of the doors. Ryan studied the mirrored walls, searching for some sign of strain, an imperfection, a delayed reflection. There was none. Vivian's gaze remained fixed on the illuminated numbers. 41, 42. The ascent felt automatic, detached from effort. In the office, the flawless partition reflected the subdued light evenly. No crack, no distortion. Ryan approached it as he had done each day, placing his palm against the cold surface. He half expected resistance to feel different, now that everything was done. It did not. Vivian arranged the conference table for another meeting that no longer carried urgency. Her movements were exact, unchanged by yesterday's signatures. Near midday, a distant siren rose from the street and lingered longer than usual. Traffic slowed briefly, then resumed its disciplined flow. Ryan stood by the window, watching the interruption dissolve into routine. Behind him, Vivian removed her glasses and held them loosely in her hand. "What now?" she asked, not looking at him. The question sounded procedural. By evening, the office had returned to its steady hum. The air conditioner maintained its measured tone. Ryan switched off his monitor and watched the room darken evenly. "We continue," he said finally. Vivian placed her glasses back on, the steel returning to her gaze. "Yes," she replied. They descended through mirrored walls that offered no fracture, only repetition, while Fifth Avenue below absorbed another day without pause. Wednesday opened with a low, colorless light that flattened the skyline into plains of gray. The espresso machine worked without protest. Ryan let the coffee sit untouched for a moment, watching the thin steam dissolve. Vivian stood at the counter, reading through a list of post-acquisition tasks. "Integration begins today," she said. He nodded. Integration suggested movement. He felt none. In the elevator, a group of junior managers joined them, speaking in controlled enthusiasm about new departments and shared systems. Their voices filled the mirrored cabin with borrowed energy. Ryan studied their reflections, young faces bright with anticipation. Vivian offered brief, exact replies. The numbers climbed. When the doors opened, the younger voices spilled into the corridor ahead of them. The office no longer felt entirely theirs. New folders lay stacked on the conference table. Additional chairs had been brought in, aligned with careful symmetry. The flawless glass partition reflected the expanded room without distortion. Ryan stood before it, noting how easily it accommodated more bodies without changing its surface. Vivian moved through the space with professional certainty, assigning roles, clarifying lines of authority. By afternoon, the hum of conversation replaced the earlier silence. Doors opened and closed. Footsteps crossed the polished floor. The air conditioner struggled slightly against the increased warmth of presence. Ryan found himself standing by the window again, watching Fifth Avenue continue its vertical rhythm, untouched by internal rearrangements. Behind him, Vivian's voice carried steady instructions. At dusk, the new team left in measured waves. The office quieted gradually. Ryan and Vivian remained beside the seamless partition, their reflections whole and distant. "It will stabilize," Vivian said, as if predicting the weather. Ryan nodded. Stabilization implied a return to equilibrium, not change. They turned off the lights and descended in silence, while the building above them held its perfect, unbroken line against the darkening sky. Thursday came with heat trapped between the buildings. The sky above Fifth Avenue looked pale and strained, as if it had been stretched too tight. The espresso machine released its narrow stream without hesitation. Ryan stood with the cup in his hand, but did not drink. Vivian checked her watch and adjusted the cuff of her blouse. "There's a transition meeting at noon," she said. He nodded. Transition had become the new word for continuation. The elevator felt warmer than usual. A faint odor of metal and perfume lingered in the enclosed space. Ryan watched the reflections rise in the mirrored walls, Two figures carried upward without visible effort. Vivian's posture remained exact, though her shoulders appeared slightly lowered. The numbers climbed. 44. The office was fuller now. Conversations moved through the room in controlled currents. New names were spoken. New roles defined. The flawless glass partition reflected multiple figures at once, multiplying their presence without altering its surface. Ryan stood before it and noticed how easily his image was absorbed among the others. Vivian directed the meeting with steady precision, her voice calm and unbroken. By afternoon, the heat pressed more firmly against the windows. The air conditioner hummed at a higher pitch, holding the interior at its chosen temperature. Ryan opened the balcony door briefly. Warm air entered, carrying the faint scent of asphalt. Vivian stepped beside him, but did not touch the railing. Below, traffic moved in its disciplined patterns, red lines threading through the city's geometry. When evening came, the office emptied in gradual stages. The new voices faded. Ryan and Vivian remained for a moment by the window, their reflections intact in the seamless pane. "It's in motion now," Vivian said quietly. Ryan looked at the city and felt the weight of the lighter in his pocket, unchanged and unused. "Yes," he replied. They turned off the lights and descended together, while the vertical stillness above Fifth Avenue remained flawless and indifferent. Friday arrived with a hard white glare that erased all softness from the skyline. The espresso machine worked in its thin, obedient rhythm. Ryan watched the final drops fall into the cup and turned it off before it finished. Vivian stood by the door, her bag already in her hand. "They're satisfied," she said, meaning the board, the investors, the invisible structure that required confirmation. He nodded. Satisfaction had no temperature. In the elevator, they were alone. The mirrored walls returned their images with clinical precision. Ryan noticed how easily the cabin contained them, two figures framed by reflection and steel. For a brief second, the elevator slowed between floors. The pause was slight, almost courteous. Vivian did not move. The ascent resumed without explanation. The office carried a faint echo of the weak-moved chairs, aligned folders, screens still warm from use. The flawless glass partition reflected the room without interruption. Ryan stood before it one last time that day, studying the complete surface. He tried to remember the sound of the crack spreading, the small white vein that had divided the space. Memory supplied it faintly, but the glass refused to confirm it. By afternoon, the final emails were sent. Integration schedules confirmed. Numbers stabilized into projection. The air conditioner hummed with steady approval. Through the window, Fifth Avenue continued its disciplined flow, untouched by internal rearrangements. Vivian removed her glasses and looked at him directly for a moment longer than usual. The steel in her gaze had softened into something quieter, not warmer, only tired. At dusk, they stood together by the window without speaking. The city below glowed in red and white lines, ascending and descending in measured rhythm. "Until Monday," Vivian said, her voice even. It no longer sounded like a habit. Ryan felt the lighter in his pocket and understood he would not use it. "Monday," he repeated. They turned off the lights and descended through mirrored walls that returned them whole and silent, while above them the building remained intact, seamless, and perfectly vertical. Torn seam at sunrise. The desert held its breath as if it had learned long ago that nothing good followed movement at night. Heat still clung to the asphalt, rising in a faint metallic scent that mixed with old gasoline. Inside the Cadillac, the air was thick with tobacco and worn leather. The dashboard lights flickered in a tired green, barely enough to outline the steering wheel beneath Clara's hands. Beyond the windshield, there was only darkness, cut now and then by road signs that flared and vanished like mute witnesses. Her dress did not belong here. Ivory silk gathered in heavy folds across the cracked seat, absorbing the smell of fuel and dust. The corset pressed against her ribs, A steady reminder of hands that had tightened it only hours before in a room cooled by church stone and quiet expectation. She was not driving toward anything. The highway stretched ahead without promise. She was simply increasing the distance between herself and a morning that had already begun without her. In the ashtray, among coins and the gray remains of older nights, lay the ring. It was smaller than she remembered. Plain gold, already dulled by fingerprints. She touched it once, lightly, as if confirming its temperature. It was cold, nothing more. She did not throw it away. That would have required a gesture. Instead, it rested where other used things ended up, collecting ash. The wipers scraped across the dry glass without warning. A short, harsh sound. There was no rain. The blades dragged once, then returned to their place with a reluctant sigh. After a few minutes, they moved again, as if the car itself could not distinguish between weather and memory. The noise irritated her, but she let it continue. Machines also have their small failures. They repeat them until someone intervenes. A gas station appeared like an afterthought in the dark. Fluorescent light pooled on cracked concrete. The attendant stepped out slowly, his shirt hanging loose, a name tag rubbed blank by years of handling. He looked at her dress without curiosity. The pump clicked into place with a metallic certainty. Fuel flowed. The smell deepened. They did not speak. When the tank was full, he removed the nozzle and nodded once. Clara returned to the driver's seat, closed the door on the light, and pulled back onto the highway, carrying the weight of a full tank and nothing else. The motel announced itself before it became visible. A few broken letters trembled in the dark, humming with uneven electricity. Blue Star, though only the B and the S burned steadily. The rest flickered as if unsure whether to remain part of the word. Clara slowed without deciding to. The gravel lot appeared in her headlights, pale and empty, holding the outlines of rooms that had long ago stopped expecting guests. She turned in. The Cadillac's tires crushed small stones with a dry, deliberate sound. The building stood low and tired beneath the neon skeleton. Curtains hung behind narrow windows, drawn tight or missing altogether. A vending machine near the office glowed faintly, its glass cracked in one corner. The night clerk watched television behind the counter, the volume low, the light blue against his face. He did not look surprised when she entered. The silk of her dress brushed against the doorframe as she stepped inside. Dust clung to the hem. The clerk's eyes moved from her veil, still pinned loosely in her hair, to her bare hands. He asked for a name. She gave him one. It did not matter which. The pen scratched across the registry book. The sound was thin and final. He handed her a key attached to a heavy plastic star, its edges worn smooth by other hands. The room smelled of old detergent and something underneath it damp wood, perhaps, or time. A bedspread patterned with faded flowers lay stiff across the mattress. The air conditioner rattled, but did not cool. Clara closed the door behind her and stood still for a moment, listening to the silence settle. It was thicker than the darkness outside. She removed the veil first. It slipped easily from her hair and fell onto the chair by the window. Then she sat on the edge of the bed without untying the corset, without touching the zipper. The ring remained in the ashtray of the car. The full tank waited outside. In the thin space between the neon hum and the distant highway, she understood that the morning would come here too, not as a rescue, only as light. The night in the motel room did not pass. It settled. The neon outside pulsed against the curtains, blue, then weaker blue, as if the sign were breathing through damaged lungs. Clara lay on top of the bedspread, still in the dress, the silk creased beneath her weight. The corset pressed upward when she inhaled. Sleep did not arrive. It hovered somewhere beyond the ceiling, indifferent. She listened to the small mechanics of the room. Pipes shifted inside the walls with dull knocks. The air conditioner rattled again and then surrendered. In the distance, a truck moved along the highway, its tires producing a low, continuous murmur. The sound did not approach or recede. It simply existed. She realized she had begun to measure time by it. Toward morning, she rose and went to the sink. The mirror above it was clouded with age. Her reflection appeared in fragments, one eye clear, the other blurred by scratches. Powder traced pale lines along her cheekbones. Mascara had settled into faint shadows beneath her eyes. She looked as if she had attended something solemn and stayed too long. She did not try to correct it. The first gray light entered without ceremony. It flattened the room, removed the blue illusion from the walls, exposed the thinness of the curtains and the cracks in the paint. Clara unlaced the corset slowly. The pressure eased in increments, like a hand withdrawing without apology. She placed the garment on the chair beside the veil. Both looked smaller there, emptied of purpose. When she stepped outside, the air carried the early chill of the desert before heat claimed it again. The Cadillac waited under a fine layer of dust. For a moment she stood still, key in hand, listening to the quiet lot and the distant engine of another departure. Then she opened the door and sat behind the wheel. The tank was still full. The road had not moved. She drove until the motel sign disappeared from the rearview mirror, and the road returned to its earlier indifference. The horizon widened into a pale strip, neither night nor day. The Cadillac moved with a steady vibration, as if the engine understood endurance better than she did. The silk of her dress had cooled during the night. It no longer clung. It simply rested against her skin like a borrowed decision. A rest area appeared without invitation. Concrete tables, a metal trash bin, a map faded by years of sun. She pulled in and cut the engine. The silence that followed was abrupt, almost physical. For a moment, she remained seated, hands on the wheel, listening to the ticking of cooling metal beneath the hood. Each click was small and precise, like a clock dismantling itself. A truck stood several spaces away, its cab painted a dull red that had surrendered to dust. The driver leaned against the door, smoking. He looked older than his posture suggested. Their eyes met briefly. He gave a single nod. It was not curiosity, not sympathy, only recognition. Two people awake at an hour that did not belong to comfort. When she stepped out, the hem of her dress caught on the edge of the door. The sound was dry and quick. She looked down. A narrow tear had opened along the seam, exposing a thin line of lining beneath. She touched the fabric once, feeling the uneven edge. The silk had resisted all night. Now it had yielded without drama. The sky shifted further toward gray. No color yet, only the removal of darkness. Clara walked a few steps away from the car and stood facing the empty lane. There were no trees, only scrub and stone stretching outward without emphasis. The air moved lightly against her face. Behind her, the truck engine started again. She did not turn around. The day would arrive, whether she acknowledged it or not. The plateau opened without transition. One moment there had been low hills, the next only flat distance, pale and exposed. The road cut through it like a thin decision that had already been made. Clara drove with the window slightly lowered. The air that entered was cold enough to sting. It carried dust and the faint smell of stone, warming toward another day. She found the last cigarette in the glove compartment. It was bent near the filter, the paper creased but intact. She placed it between her lips and searched for the lighter. The first strike failed. The second produced only a weak spark. On the fifth attempt, the flame held, small and unsteady. She drew in slowly. The tip glowed, then steadied into a dull orange certainty. Smoke gathered near the ceiling of the car, then drifted toward the open window in thin ribbons. She watched it break apart in the moving air. Each exhale reduced the cigarette by a measurable amount. Fire turning to ash without resistance. She tapped it once against the edge of the ashtray, careful not to disturb the ring still resting there, gold and gray beside each other, neither commenting on the other's presence. The fuel gauge remained full. It did not tremble. The needle held its place with quiet confidence. She realized that the car required nothing from her except direction and pressure on the pedal. It did not ask where she intended to go. It accepted movement as sufficient explanation. When the cigarette burned too close to her fingers, she extinguished it and let the remains fall among the others. Ahead, the sun lifted itself over the horizon. It did not glow warmly. It clarified. The dust on the windshield, the tear in her dress, the faint lines beside her mouth, everything stood out under the new light. Clara slowed and pulled onto the shoulder. She did not step out. She sat with both hands resting loosely in her lap, watching the brightness spread across the empty land. There was no revelation in it, only another day beginning. The sun rose higher and removed the last excuse for shadow. Heat began its slow return, pressing against the windshield, entering through the thin seals of the doors. Clara started the engine again. The sound was steady, almost patient. The plateau stretched forward without variation. No towns, no billboards promising anything. Only distance laid flat beneath the widening light. She adjusted the rearview mirror. For a moment, she saw only glare. Then her own face settled into it, pale against the darker interior. The veil was gone. The makeup had thinned. There were fine lines near her eyes she had not noticed before. The mirror did not accuse her. It offered no interpretation. It simply returned what stood before it. Behind her, the road narrowed into a single gray thread. Nothing followed. No car, no truck. The past reduced itself quickly when viewed at speed. She understood that leaving did not erase. It only changed scale. The church, the guests, the unfinished vows, they existed somewhere behind that thin line, intact and indifferent to her absence. She drove until a sign appeared announcing a town whose name meant nothing to her. Population, 1,842. The numbers were sun-faded, but legible. She considered turning in. There would be a diner, perhaps a laundromat, a hardware store with dusty windows. People who did not know her name. The thought did not comfort her. It merely presented itself as an option. Instead, she continued past the exit. The fuel gauge had begun its first small descent, almost imperceptible. A full tank does not remain full. It yields gradually, without protest. Clara kept her hands steady on the wheel. The road did not promise change. It promised continuation. For now, that was enough. By midday, the heat had settled fully over the land. It did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated. The air above the asphalt shimmered in thin, wavering lines. Clara reduced her speed without noticing the exact moment she did so. The engine responded with a lower hum, less strained, as if conserving its strength for miles that offered no variation. A roadside diner appeared ahead, low and rectangular, its paint faded into a color that might once have been white. A single pickup truck stood in the gravel lot. She turned in, more from habit than hunger. The Cadillac came to rest beneath a narrow strip of shade cast by the building's roof. When she stepped out, the torn seam of her dress brushed against her calf, a quiet reminder of the doorframe hours earlier. Inside, the air was cooler, but heavy with old grease and cleaning fluid. A ceiling fan rotated slowly, distributing the same air in patient circles. Two men sat at the counter, their shoulders broad and still. They did not look at her immediately. The waitress approached with a pad already in her hand. Her eyes paused on the silk, on the bare ring finger, then returned to Clara's face. "Coffee?" she asked. Clara nodded. The cup arrived full and dark. She held it without drinking, feeling the heat pass into her palms. At the far end of the counter, a radio produced a faint country song distorted by static. The sound faded and returned, as if unsure whether it deserved to be heard. No one commented on it. No one commented on her. When she finally stepped back outside, the sun had climbed higher. The pickup was gone. The highway lay open again, indifferent. Clara paused beside the Cadillac, her hand resting on the warm metal of the door. For a moment, she considered removing the dress, folding it, leaving it on the passenger seat like an abandoned costume. Instead, she opened the door and slid behind the wheel. The engine started on the first turn. The day continued without inquiry. The afternoon thinned into a pale, exhausted light. The sky lost its depth and became a wide, colorless sheet stretched above the plateau. Clara drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the ashtray. The ring lay where it had been since the night began. It had gathered a fine layer of gray dust. She brushed it aside with her thumb. The metal beneath was unchanged. The radio, silent for hours, suddenly caught a signal. A woman's voice drifted in Spanish, soft and steady, speaking about something practical. Weather, perhaps. Then music followed, thin through static, a melody that repeated itself without urgency. Clara listened for a minute. The words did not belong to her, but the rhythm did. After a while, the signal fractured and dissolved back into noise. She did not adjust the dial. A memory arrived without invitation. Morning light across a white tablecloth. A spoon turning slowly inside a porcelain cup. Her mother speaking in a low voice about patience, about the stability of certain choices. Clara had watched the reflection of sunlight in the spoon's curve. It had seemed more solid than the promises being discussed. The coffee had been too bitter. She had finished it anyway. The fuel gauge had moved lower now, no longer full, but not yet urgent. She calculated the distance to the next station without anxiety. The numbers were simple: miles, gallons, time. The car asked for attention only in these measurable ways. It did not inquire about reasons. It did not require explanations for direction. The sun began its descent slowly, almost imperceptibly. Shadows lengthened behind roadside markers, thin and precise. Clara rolled the window down further. The air entering the car was cooler again, carrying the faint scent of distant earth. She drove on without increasing speed. There was no need to arrive before dark. There was no place that required her presence. Only the steady reduction of daylight and the quiet hum of the engine keeping her company. Toward evening, the sky began to gather color again, not warmth, but a restrained copper that lay low along the horizon. Clara had been driving for hours without marking the time. The rhythm of the road had settled into her muscles. When she saw the sign for another gas station, she turned in without hesitation. The gauge had dropped below half. It was not yet a warning, only a reminder. The station stood alone beside the highway, two pumps beneath a metal canopy that rattled in the wind. The man who stepped out to meet her was younger than the one from the night before. His shirt was clean, but already damp at the collar. He looked at the car first, then at her dress, then back at the car. His expression did not change. He inserted the nozzle and squeezed the handle. The pump began its steady mechanical counting. Clara leaned against the door while the tank filled. The wind tugged lightly at the torn seam of her dress. The fabric moved, but did not tear further. She watched the numbers climb on the pump display. Gallons, dollars, each unit precise. The smell of gasoline rose sharp and familiar. For a moment, she closed her eyes and listened to the liquid entering the tank, the faint echo inside metal. Long way? The attendant asked finally, not looking directly at her. Yes, she replied. He nodded as if that answer contained enough information. When the pump clicked off, he removed it with a practiced motion and hung it back in place. No advice, no curiosity, only the exchange of fuel for money. Back inside the Cadillac, she started the engine and glanced at the mirror. The light behind her was thinning again. The day was closing without resistance. The tank was full once more. The road waded in the same direction as before. She signaled out of habit, though no other car approached, and pulled back onto the highway as the first trace of dusk settled over the land. Darkness returned without ceremony. It did not fall. It accumulated along the edges of the road until the headlights were the only clear shapes in the world. Clara drove with the windows closed now. The air inside the Cadillac had grown heavy again, touched by smoke, and the faint sweetness of old upholstery warmed all day. The dashboard lights glowed in their tired green. The fuel gauge held steady at full. Far ahead, she saw something low and motionless near the shoulder. As she approached, the shape resolved into a dog sitting in the dust. It did not move when her lights reached it. Its eyes reflected briefly, 2 small points of pale brightness. The animal watched the car without expectation, as if headlights were a common event and not worth reacting to. Clara's foot eased from the accelerator. The engine dropped to a softer tone. For a second, she considered pulling over. The thought came without sentiment. A simple calculation. Space in the back seat, a town eventually, water. Then another thought followed just as plainly. She did not know where she was going. She did not know how long she would continue. The dog remained seated as she passed. In the rearview mirror, it diminished quickly, reduced to a small shadow at the edge of the light. Then it disappeared entirely. The road resumed its uninterrupted line. Nothing marked the moment except the slight return of speed. She drove on. The radio produced only static. The torn seam of her dress brushed against her knee with each movement of her leg. The ring lay in the ashtray, unmoving. Ahead, the headlights carved out another narrow corridor through the dark. Behind her, whatever she had left behind remained intact, untouched by her departure. The night accepted both facts without comment. The night deepened until the sky and the land were no longer separate things. The headlights pressed forward into a darkness that absorbed them without resistance. Clara reached for the radio again. Her fingers turned the dial slowly. Static shifted in tone, from a dry hiss to a low murmur, then briefly to a distant voice that dissolved before forming a sentence. She left it there, between stations. The sound was thin but constant, like breath through closed teeth. It filled the car without demanding attention. Now and then a fragment of music surfaced 2 notes of a trumpet. A woman's laughter carried from somewhere too far to identify, then vanished again into interference. The signals did not hold. They appeared and withdrew without explanation. The rhythm of the tires against the road became more pronounced in the absence of anything clear from the speakers. A steady hum, rising and falling with minor changes in the asphalt. Clara rested her hand near the ashtray. She did not touch the ring this time. It lay beneath a light layer of gray, its shape barely visible unless the dashboard light caught it directly. She considered the fact that radio waves traveled across distances she could not see. Invisible lines crossing desert and mountains, intersecting above her without her knowledge. Most of them never reached her clearly. They arrived broken or not at all. She understood this without bitterness. Not every signal is meant to be received. The gauge still read full. The engine maintained its even tone. Clara adjusted the mirror once more, but the darkness behind her reflected nothing. No headlights, no approaching shape. Only her own faint outline in the glass and the intermittent glow of static from the radio. She kept driving, listening to the small, persistent noise that proved the world existed beyond the reach of her light. Close to midnight, the weight of the dress became undeniable. The silk had stiffened with dust and sweat, losing whatever softness it once claimed. Clara shifted in the seat and felt the corset press again against her ribs. The pressure was no longer sharp. It was dull and constant, like a hand that had forgotten why it was holding on. She slowed the car and pulled onto a narrow shoulder where the land fell away into darker emptiness. The engine idled. For a moment, she remained seated, listening to its low vibration. Then she reached down and unfastened her shoes. They dropped to the floor with a muted sound. Her bare feet touched the worn rubber mat. The surface was uneven, gritty, real. She bent forward and loosened the laces at her back, not fully, only enough to let her lungs expand without resistance. The dress shifted around her, less rigid now. It no longer resembled ceremony. It was fabric, nothing more. Outside, the desert lay invisible beyond the reach of her headlights. There were no insects, no distant houses, no movement she could detect. Only the faint wind pressing against the side of the car. She turned off the engine. Silence entered at once, heavy and complete. In that silence, she felt neither fear nor comfort, only the awareness of her own breathing and the slow settling of metal as it cooled. Tomorrow would require some form of clothing, some explanation if she chose to stop somewhere. Tonight required nothing. She leaned back against the seat, her feet resting flat and unguarded on the floor, and let the dark remain undisturbed around her. A thin gray line appeared at the edge of the horizon, so faint at first it could have been imagined. Clara had not slept. She had closed her eyes, but the dark behind them had been the same as the dark outside. When she opened them again, the gray had widened. It was not yet light, only the withdrawal of night. She started the engine before the sun showed itself. The sound seemed louder after the long stillness. The headlights were unnecessary now, but she left them on for a while out of habit. The road re-emerged gradually, its painted lines dull and incomplete, its surface marked by long cracks filled with older repairs. Fatigue settled over her in a different way than the previous day. It was not sharp. It was heavy, like a blanket laid carefully across her shoulders. Her movements were slower, but deliberate. She did not rush the car into higher speed. There was no advantage in arriving sooner. The sky shifted from gray to a pale, diluted blue. The land revealed itself again in measured detail stones, scrub, a distant fence running without clear purpose. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth photographing. The simplicity of it pressed against her thoughts and left them without argument. She drove on as the first direct light touched the windshield. It did not warm her. It clarified the dust, the small chips in the glass, the faint crease between her brows reflected in the mirror. Another day had begun without asking her consent. The fuel gauge had begun its slow descent again. She watched it for a moment, then returned her eyes to the road. By late morning, the traffic increased slightly. Not enough to form a line, only enough to remind her that others were moving as well. A rest area appeared ahead, marked by a blue sign and a narrow strip of trees planted years ago for shade. She turned in without much thought. The engine needed a pause, so did she. A single semi-truck occupied the far end of the lot. Its engine idled with a low, patient growl. The cab was white beneath a film of road dust. Clara parked several spaces away and stepped out. The air carried the mixed scent of diesel and warm gravel. Her torn dress moved lightly around her legs. In daylight, the scene looked less dramatic, more like ordinary wear. The truck driver stood beside his cab, smoking. He was broad-shouldered, his hair cut short, his face marked by sun and wind. He glanced at her once and then held her gaze for a second longer than necessary. There was no question in it, only recognition. Two people who had not slept enough and had chosen motion over explanation. She walked toward the edge of the lot where the land dropped into open distance. The wind pressed against her back, steady and cool. Behind her, the truck engine continued its low vibration. It sounded almost like breathing. She did not turn around. There was nothing to say that would change either of their directions. After a few minutes, she returned to the car. The driver flicked his cigarette to the ground and crushed it beneath his boot. He gave a small nod. She answered with one of her own. Then she slid back behind the wheel. When she started the engine, it responded without hesitation. The truck pulled out first. She waited until it cleared the exit, then followed at a distance that did not imply company. The sun stood high when she stopped again, this time at a stretch of empty shoulder, where the asphalt widened slightly before narrowing back into its usual line. There was no sign, no building, nothing to justify the pause. She turned off the engine and opened the door carefully, as if expecting resistance. When she stepped out, the hem of her dress caught once more on the metal edge. The sound was sharper this time. She looked down and saw the tear widen along the seam, opening into a longer, uneven line. Threads hung loose, pale against the dust. She did not attempt to repair it. The silk had been strained since mooring. Now it simply acknowledged it. The heat pressed down without mercy. It flattened the land and reduced every color to a lighter shade of itself. Clara stood beside the car and ran her fingers along the torn fabric. The material felt thinner than she remembered. Expensive things do not always endure. They only appear to, until friction proves otherwise. She walked a few steps away from the Cadillac and looked across the plateau. No movement, no distant houses, only space that refused decoration. The wind moved lightly, lifting the loose threads of her dress and laying them back against her skin. There was no anger in her, no grief, only a quiet recognition that the night had left its mark in more ways than one. When she returned to the car, she did not smooth the fabric. She let it hang as it was and closed the door without caution. The engine started again, steady as before. In the rearview mirror, the place where she had stood became indistinguishable from every other stretch of road she had passed. The land rose gradually into a wide plateau where nothing interrupted the line of sight. No fences now, no telephone poles. Only stone and low brush flattened by wind. Clara drove more slowly, not because the road demanded it, but because speed felt unnecessary in a place that did not change. The wind moved across the open space in visible currents, lifting dust in thin spirals that dissolved as quickly as they formed. The sky was a clear, hard blue. It did not promise rain or relief. It simply existed above the exposed earth. Through the open window, the air entered sharp and dry, touching her face with a coolness that would not last. She stopped the car near the edge of a shallow incline and left the engine running. The sound seemed smaller here, almost embarrassed by the scale of the silence around it. Clara stepped out and walked a short distance away. The torn dress brushed against her legs, lighter now, as if the fabric had accepted its altered shape. From where she stood, the horizon formed a clean line. There were no buildings, no smoke, no movement to distract the eye. It was a landscape that offered no concealment. Whatever one carried was carried openly. The wind pressed against her chest and moved past her without resistance. After a while, she returned to the Cadillac and turned off the engine. The sudden absence of its hum made the plateau feel even wider. She leaned against the warm metal and looked outward once more. There was nothing to decide here. The place did not require confession or promise. It required only presence. And for the moment, that was what she had. By late afternoon, the light began to thin again, losing its hardness. Clara returned to the car and resumed driving, the plateau slowly lowering back into open road. The fuel gauge had fallen below half once more. She did not calculate the exact distance left. The descent of the needle was steady and honest. Her hand moved to the glove compartment out of habit. It was empty now, except for an old receipt and a folded map she had not opened. She searched again and found a cigarette lodged near the hinge, slightly crushed but intact enough. She held it up to the light, considering its fragility, then placed it between her lips. The lighter resisted at first. One spark, then none. On the third attempt, a small flame appeared and wavered in the moving air. She cupped her hand around it until the tip caught. The paper burned unevenly, but it burned. She inhaled slowly. The smoke entered her lungs with a familiar weight, then left in a thin, dissolving stream. Ash gathered at the end, and threatened to fall. She tapped it carefully into the ashtray near the ring. Gold and gray again, close but unrelated. The cigarette shortened with each breath. A small, measurable reduction. When it burned too near her fingers, she extinguished it without ceremony. The sun touched the horizon and began its descent. The light did not warm, it revealed. The dust along the dashboard, the fine lines on her hands, the uneven tear of the silk. Clara kept her eyes on the road. The tank was not empty yet. There was still distance to cover before night reclaimed the land. She drove on, steady and without acceleration. The sun lifted itself slowly over the horizon without spectacle. Its light spread across the plateau in a pale wash that erased the last shadows. Clara had driven through the fading dark and into this thin brightness without noticing the exact moment of change. The Cadillac moved at a moderate pace, engine steady, as if nothing in the world had shifted. She pulled onto the shoulder, and the light became too direct against the windshield. The gravel crunched beneath the tires and then settled. She turned off the engine. The sudden quiet was not dramatic. It was simple. Heat began to gather immediately on the metal hood, rising in faint, invisible waves. Inside the car, everything stood exposed. The torn seam of her dress lay open against her thigh. Dust coated the dashboard in a fine layer. In the ashtray, the ring rested among gray fragments, its surface dull in the new light. Clara looked at it for a long moment, but did not reach for it. It was still metal, nothing more. Beyond the windshield, the land stretched out without interruption. No buildings, no figures, no approaching vehicles. The morning did not offer instruction. It did not judge. It illuminated. The clarity was almost indifferent, as if the day were simply another surface she would have to cross. She remained seated, hands resting loosely in her lap. There was no plan forming, no sudden resolve. The fuel gauge showed enough for several more hours. That was a fact. The rest remained undefined. Clara watched the light spread further across the empty ground and understood that this, too, would pass into another stretch of road. The day had begun. Diesel, soap, and silence. Room 9 at the Blue Star Motel smelled of damp carpet and something older, as if the air had been sealed and reopened too many times. The neon outside bled a yellow pulse through the curtains, steady and tired. Colin set his bag on the only chair and closed the door without noise. He stood for a moment, listening to the highway breathe. Trucks passed in the distance, their engines low and patient, like animals that knew exactly where they were going. The linoleum near the sink had worn thin in the shape of other men's feet. The bed gave a dry complaint when he pressed it with his palm. Above the basin hung the mirror. A single crack ran through it from top to bottom, clean and deliberate. It did not distort the room. It simply divided it. Colin washed his hands with a small bar of motel soap. Diesel and cheap perfume from the gas station clung to his skin. He dried them slowly, as if the gesture mattered. He tried to shave. The water came out lukewarm, with a faint taste of rust that settled on his tongue. When he raised his eyes, the mirror split his face in two. One eye sat slightly higher, the mouth misaligned, the scar on his chin pulled into a separate story. He leaned left, then right, searching for an angle where the pieces might join. There was none. The glass offered him fragments and kept the rest. Brooke entered without knocking, a bundle of towels against her hip. Smoke from her Pall Mall drifted ahead of her like a quiet announcement. She did not look at him directly. Her gaze rested on the cracked line. "Should have fixed that," she said. He rinsed the razor and answered, "No need. It's clearer this way." She nodded once. The silence between them had weight. It settled on the sink, on the floor, on the bed's thin mattress. Later, he sat on the edge of the bed and let ash fall where it wished. He touched the crack with one finger. The edge bit him, and a dark bead of blood rose slowly, almost with reluctance. He pressed it against the glass and left it there. Even if the mirror were whole, he knew the stranger inside would remain. Outside, the neon continued its uneven rhythm. Morning would come without promise. The road would still be there, waiting for a man who no longer recognized himself in any reflection. Dawn did not arrive. It thinned the dark until the room could no longer pretend to hide anything. The neon outside surrendered to a pale, indifferent sky. Colin had not slept. He lay on top of the blanket, boots still on, listening to the plumbing cough in distant rooms. Somewhere a door closed, carefully. The world was already moving, without asking him to join. He rose and stood again before the mirror. The dried blood had turned almost brown against the crack. He washed his face. The water traced the line in the glass and divided him once more. He tried, out of habit, to assemble himself from what he saw. The scar, the graying stubble, the tired lids that refused to lift fully. It felt like reading a report about a man he used to know. The details were accurate. The meaning was gone. In the parking lot, dew clung to the windshield of his old sedan. The car had once been white. Now it was the color of forgotten paper. He wiped a clear strip with his sleeve and looked through it at the highway. It ran straight across Nebraska, as if drawn by someone who had no patience for curves. He did not start the engine. He sat with both hands on the steering wheel, feeling its thin vibration from trucks passing nearby. Brooke stood by the office door with her morning cigarette. The smoke rose and vanished into the open air. She watched the road the way others watch the sea, expecting something to return that never does. Their eyes met briefly. There was no farewell in it, only acknowledgement. She had seen too many departures to attach weight to another. Colin finally turned the key. The engine hesitated, then caught. He did not look in the rearview mirror as he pulled away. There was nothing behind him that required confirmation. The road ahead was empty and exact. It did not promise forgiveness or change. It offered only distance. He drove because remaining would have required an explanation he no longer possessed. By noon, the highway had flattened into a pale ribbon beneath a sky without edges. Colin drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely near the gear shift. The radio worked only when it wished to. Static filled the spaces between stations, a dry whisper that suited him. He let it speak. Words would have required agreement. He stopped at a gas station outside a town that seemed assembled from spare parts. 2 grain silos, a shuttered diner, a church with peeling paint. The pump handle was warm from the sun. Gasoline spilled once, briefly, and the smell rose sharp and familiar. He wiped his hands on his jeans. Diesel and soap had been replaced by fuel again. Some habits return without effort. Inside, a young cashier looked past him, as if expecting someone larger, more decisive. Colin bought black coffee and nothing else. The cup burned his palm. He stood by the window and watched trucks refuel, their drivers speaking in short, efficient sentences. He could read their posture. Route, cargo, schedule. A life measured in miles and delivery times. He had once belonged to that grammar. Back in the car, he unfolded an old map from the glove compartment. The paper had softened along its creases. Pennsylvania was there in faded blue and green, precise and distant. He did not touch it. He folded the map again and placed it back without deciding anything. Direction felt unnecessary. Motion was sufficient. When he returned to the road, the sun had shifted slightly, but the landscape remained unchanged. Fields stretched outward, patient and indifferent. He drove without haste. The mirror above the windshield reflected only sky. He did not check it. The stranger it carried would remain silent either way. Toward evening, he left the highway without planning to. The exit appeared, and his hands followed it. The town at the end of the ramp had a single traffic light that changed for no one. A grocery store with darkened windows stood beside a bar that advertised cold beer in letters already peeling away. He parked along the curb and sat a moment before stepping out, as if the air might object to him. Inside the bar, the light was amber and tired. A jukebox in the corner blinked without conviction. 3 men occupied the counter, speaking in low voices about machinery and weather. Colin took a seat at the far end. The bartender placed a glass before him without asking. Whiskey, measured and unadorned. He drank slowly. The liquid did not warm him. It only settled. A television above the shelves played a news report without sound. Moving lips, urgent captions. Colin watched the images pass. Accidents, elections, distant storms. The world arranged into brief fragments and replaced by others. He recognized the rhythm. It resembled the mirror in room 9 faces, divided by lines no one could repair. When he left, the sky had turned a flat violet. Streetlights hummed faintly. He walked back to the car and paused beside the door. In the darkened window, he saw his outline layered over the empty street. Not a reflection nor an interruption. He lifted his hand and touched the glass. It was cool, intact. For a moment, he waited for something to align inside him. Nothing did. He drove out of town without switching on the radio. The road ahead narrowed, then widened again. He kept his eyes forward. Somewhere behind him, the traffic light continued its cycle for an empty intersection. Night found him on a secondary road where the lines were faded and the shoulders crumbled into fields. The headlights carved 2 narrow tunnels through the dark. Insects struck the windshield and disappeared without sound. Colin drove more slowly now. There was no schedule to honor, no cargo to protect. Only the steady hum of the engine and the faint tremor in the steering wheel. He pulled over near an abandoned rest area. The vending machines inside the brick shelter were unplugged, their glass fronts reflecting only his silhouette. He sat on a metal bench and lit a cigarette. The smoke rose straight up. There was no wind. In the distance, a freight train moved across the horizon, its lights sliding past like a separate life that required neither memory nor explanation. He thought of Pennsylvania without images, not of streets or houses, but of weight. Words spoken too late, a door closed harder than intended, a hand that had not reached back. The past had no single moment of collapse. It had eroded quietly, like paint under constant rain. By the time he noticed, the surface was already gone. He returned to the car and looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. It was whole there, unbroken. The glass was clean, obedient. Yet the face it offered felt just as distant as the one in room 9. The problem had never been the crack. It had been the certainty that the man looking back carried decisions he could not undo. He started the engine again. The fuel gauge rested just above half. Enough for another stretch of road. He did not calculate distance. He merged back onto the asphalt and let the darkness close behind him. The night did not judge. It did not forgive. It simply allowed him to continue, and for now that was sufficient. After the last note, the heater had been turned off a week ago, but the smell of old varnish and smoke still clung to the walls of the rusty key. Outside, the highway lay submerged in darkness, its only proof the distant hum of trucks that never slowed. Joseph sat upright at the piano, as if posture alone could preserve what his fingers no longer could. The ashtray on the lid held the last of his cigarette. Smoke rose in a thin, disciplined line before the draft from the door bent it sideways. His shadow on the wall was long and patient. It did not tremble. When he pressed the pedal, something inside the instrument answered with a dry complaint metal touching metal. He did not think of notes anymore. He felt resistance. Each key carried weight, as if the wood had absorbed all the years of unpaid evenings. The piano had grown heavier, or perhaps his hands had. It was difficult to tell which one of them was failing first. Behind the counter, Blake counted the register. Coins struck wood with a restrained sound clink, clink. He wore his sleeves rolled above the elbows, though there was no heat to justify it. His grip on the glass he was drying was tighter than necessary. He did not look at Joseph. The bar had fewer chairs than it used to, but the empty ones seemed to occupy more space. Blake approached without speaking and placed a small glass of gin on the piano. Clear liquid, no ice, no lemon. Joseph let the last chord fade before glancing at it. He understood what it meant. The final drink on account. Their eyes met briefly, then shifted away, as if acknowledging something too fragile to hold directly. Joseph began a slow, almost unrecognizable jazz standard. The melody wandered without urgency. In the reflection of the piano's dark surface, he saw Blake move toward the door. The chain rattled once. The sign turned from open to closed with a muted scrape. Joseph did not stop playing. His fingers grew heavier, as though the keys had been recast in lead. The last chord lingered above the dust and settled there, indistinguishable from the silence that followed. Blake waited until the last vibration dissolved into the ceiling beams before, switching off the row of yellow bulbs above the bar. One remained over the piano. It cast a tired circle of light around Joseph's shoulders and left the rest of the room to cool in shadow. The floor smelled of cheap cleaner. Somewhere behind the wall, a refrigerator motor coughed and went quiet again. Joseph did not rise immediately. He rested his palms flat on the keys, not pressing, only feeling their cold. The wood had lost the warmth of his hands already. He closed the lid with care, as if the instrument might bruise. The ashtray tipped slightly. Gray flakes slid and settled. He brushed them back with two stiff fingers. "Gonna lock up," Blake said. Joseph nodded. "All right." Blake collected the glasses one by one. The gin remained untouched on the piano until he reached for it and poured it back into the bottle without comment. The gesture was practical, almost respectful. He wiped the rim with his thumb and set the bottle down. The cash drawer slid shut with a final, obedient click. Outside, the parking lot stretched empty beneath a thin moon. Joseph lifted his coat collar against the wind and walked toward his old Ford. The engine resisted before turning over, metal grinding in brief protest. In the rearview mirror, he saw Blake standing in the doorway, keys hanging from his hand. No wave, no promise. The headlights cut a pale corridor toward the highway, and Joseph drove into it without looking back. The highway accepted him without question. It always did. The tires hummed against the asphalt in a tone steadier than any melody he had played that night. Joseph kept both hands on the wheel. The skin across his knuckles looked thin in the dashboard light, mapped with small, pale scars from years of lifting equipment and folding chairs after shows that no one remembered. He drove past the dark outline of grain silos and the closed gas station, where the fluorescent sign flickered without conviction. A truck overtook him, wind pressing briefly against the Ford side before releasing it again. Joseph did not accelerate. There was no place he needed to reach. The road was simply a continuation of the room he had left long, narrow, indifferent. At a red light in a town already asleep, he flexed his fingers against the steering wheel. They answered slowly. Tomorrow, he would not have to trim his nails short. He would not need to keep them shaped for the keys. The thought did not hurt. It felt like setting down a heavy coat after winter. He examined his hands as if they belonged to someone he had once known well. The light turned green. He passed a motel with a vacancy sign glowing in uneven letters. For a moment, he considered stopping, not from fatigue, but from habit. Musicians were always between places. He drove on instead. The night air seeped faintly through the door seals, carrying the smell of dust and distant diesel. Behind him, far back along the highway, the rusty key dissolved into darkness. Blake would be finishing his last inspection, checking locks that no longer guarded anything valuable. Joseph kept his eyes on the road ahead. The headlights carved out a narrow certainty in the blackness, and that was sufficient. By the time Joseph reached the edge of town, the fuel gauge had settled just above empty. He turned into a small, all-night station, more out of instinct than need. The fluorescent canopy hummed overhead, bleaching the color from his coat and hands. He stepped out slowly, joints stiff, and unscrewed the gas cap with a careful twist. The metal was colder than he expected. As the pump clicked and fuel began to flow, he leaned one forearm against the roof of the Ford. The sound was steady, mechanical. It reminded him of a metronome he once owned and later sold for groceries. He watched the numbers climb. They meant distance, nothing more. He did not calculate how far. Inside the station, a young clerk sat behind the counter, scrolling through his phone. The television mounted in the corner played muted sports highlights. Joseph paid in cash. The bills were folded precisely. The clerk did not look up long enough to notice the tremor in Joseph's fingers. Back in the car, he did not start the engine immediately. The windshield framed the empty highway like a stage without performers. He flexed his hands once more, then rested them on his thighs. Without the weight of the piano keys beneath them, they seemed unsure where to settle. When he finally turned the ignition, the engine answered with a dull, obedient rumble. Joseph pulled back onto the road. The station lights receded in the mirror, shrinking to a pale blur. Ahead, the darkness remained unchanged, wide and patient, offering nothing except the space to continue. He left the highway without signaling and followed a narrow road that curved toward a strip of low buildings. A motel stood there, its paint peeling in long, patient strips. The vacancy sign flickered unevenly, one letter already dark. Joseph parked beneath a weak exterior light and sat for a moment before stepping out. The air carried the smell of damp concrete. The woman at the front desk did not ask questions. She slid a key across the counter, attached to a block of scratched plastic. Room 12. Joseph climbed the outside stairs slowly, each step answering with a dull echo. Inside, the room held a bedspread with a faded pattern and a small lamp, whose shade leaned slightly to one side. He placed his coat on the chair and stood still, listening to the silence settle. He washed his hands in the narrow sink. Gray water circled the drain. The mirror above it returned a face lying deeply enough to hold small shadows. He examined his fingers under the yellow light. They were wider at the joints now, less obedient. He pressed them against the cool porcelain and felt nothing except the firmness of it. On the bedside table lay a notepad with the motel's name printed at the top. He picked up the pen and held it without writing. After a moment, he set it down again. There was nothing to record. The day had already reduced itself to simple actions. Keys pressed, glass lifted, door closed. Joseph lay back fully dressed. Through the thin curtains, a distant truck passed, its headlights sliding briefly across the ceiling before disappearing. He closed his eyes without expectation. Tomorrow would not ask him to sit upright at a piano. It would not require trimmed nails or steady rhythm. It would only require that he wake, and that seemed manageable. $3 and rain. The sky hung low over the Ohio town, pressing its damp weight against the roofs and the backs of men who had nowhere left to go. The name on the road sign had faded into a pale blur, as if the town itself had grown tired of being called. Hayes sat inside his old Ford and watched the bank across the street. It was all glass and clean lines, a foreign object among the collapsing brick warehouses. Oil stains shimmered on the asphalt, like weak rainbows trapped in mud. The diner's neon sign flickered and crackled above him, persistent and nervous. He crossed the street and entered the diner. The air smelled of burnt coffee and frying grease. Claire poured him a black coffee without looking at him. Her smile belonged only to her lips. Her eyes remained elsewhere. Hayes felt for the card in his pocket. Its edge was sharp, cutting lightly into his finger. It was the only object in his life that still carried authority. A thin leash made of plastic and numbers. From the window, He saw a bank employee step outside for a cigarette. The man leaned against the wall, calm inside his routine. Hayes understood then. As long as he owed them, he existed in their system. Debt was proof of life. Without it, he would be erased, like the factory payroll after the shutdown. The coffee cooled. A brown ring formed along the rim of the cup. Something inside him loosened, quietly, without drama. Behind the bank, near a gray metal container, he took out a cheap plastic lighter. The flame hesitated before catching the corner of the card. The plastic burned stubbornly, curling inward. The smell was thick, like tires melting on hot asphalt. The letters bent and blackened until they disappeared. He dropped the charred fragment into the trash. The account would still live somewhere in a server, but the tether in his hands was gone. When he returned, Claire looked up. "More coffee?" she asked. He nodded. $3 remained in his pocket, folded and warm from his skin. Outside, rain began to fall, washing dust from the Ford's windshield. The light in the diner was dim but steady. Hayes felt a quiet calm settle over him, the kind a soldier might feel after losing the last battle and realizing there would be no more orders. For the first time in years, nothing was pulling at him. Rain settled over the town without urgency. It did not cleanse anything. It only made the bricks darker and the air heavier. Hayes watched the drops slide down the diner window, bending the reflection of the bank into a trembling shape. The world outside blurred, but the glass remained between him and it. Claire refilled his cup. The coffee was thin now, almost metallic. He counted the $3 beneath the table, pressing the bills flat against his thigh. They felt softer than the card had, less certain. Across the street, the bank lights flickered on, square and patient. Inside, people moved behind the glass, reduced to silhouettes. He imagined his name still glowing somewhere in their system, a number without a face. It would take time before anyone noticed the silence. Claire wiped the counter in slow, circular motions. "Storm's staying," she said, not looking at him. "So am I," he answered. The words surprised him. Staying had never been part of the plan. He had always imagined departure as the only form of dignity left. But now there was no factory to return to, no account to manage, no reminder vibrating in his pocket. The leash had burned. What remained was emptiness, but it was his. Outside, a gust of wind pushed rain against the Ford. The truck looked smaller without dust, its age exposed by clean water. Hayes felt the weight of the keys in his palm. They no longer led to a job or to payments due on Fridays. They led only to motion. Claire set the pot down beside him. Their eyes met briefly. In the weak yellow light, her face seemed less guarded, not hopeful, just present. Hayes lifted the cup again. The diner hummed around them, refrigerators breathing, neon buzzing. Nothing had improved. Nothing had been solved. But for the first time, the future did not demand proof of his existence. It waited, blank and indifferent, like the road beyond the rain. Morning arrived without color. The rain had thinned to a mist that clung to the sidewalks and the rusted railings along the street. Hayes had not slept. He remained in the booth, watching the sky shift from charcoal to a dull gray. The bank stood quiet now, its glass reflecting a town that looked smaller in daylight. Trucks passed without stopping. The world had resumed its rhythm without asking for him. Claire brought him a glass of water. The coffee pot was empty. "You should get some rest," she said softly. He nodded, but did not move. Rest implied tomorrow. Tomorrow implied a direction. He felt instead like a man who had stepped out of a line and found no other queue waiting. The $3 were gone too for the coffee. One left as a tip he could not afford. The table in front of him was clean, wiped of any trace he had been there. Outside, the Ford sat beneath the weak sky. Water beaded along its hood. The truck looked patient, as if it understood waiting better than he did. Hayes stepped out into the damp air and stood beside it. The key turned easily in the ignition. The engine answered with a tired growl. It was the only thing that still responded when called. He did not drive far. Just beyond the edge of town, past the closed factory with its broken windows and faded logo, he parked facing an empty field where the earth had been turned and abandoned. The air smelled of wet soil and distant fuel. He shut off the engine and listened to the ticking metal cool. For a long moment, he considered turning back, reclaiming something of the system he had left behind. But there was nothing to reclaim. The debt would continue without him. The bank would send letters to an address he no longer trusted. Hayes leaned back in the seat. The sky pressed low over the field. He felt neither triumph nor regret, only the quiet weight of being unaccounted for. By noon, the mist had lifted, leaving behind a thin brightness that exposed everything without warmth. Hayes drove back toward town because there was nowhere else to measure the day. The factory roof appeared first, a long line of corrugated metal sagging between broken skylights. The parking lot was empty except for weeds pushing through the cracks. He parked where his spot had once been, third row near the loading dock. The doors were chained now. A notice flapped against the brick wall, bleached by sun and rain. He stood there longer than necessary, hands in his jacket pockets, as if waiting for a whistle that would never sound again. His palms still carried the memory of steel parts, their weight and cold precision. The air held only dust. A pickup passed slowly on the road. The driver did not look at him. Hayes felt a strange clarity settle in. The factory had erased his name 3 years ago. The bank would do the same in time. Systems were patient. They forgot in silence. He had mistaken gut for belonging. It had only been a receipt. He returned to the Ford and drove toward the river at the edge of town. The water moved steadily, indifferent to closures and credit limits. He sat on the hood and watched the current. There was no plan forming, no revelation, just the sound of water pressing against stone. As evening approached, the town lights blinked on one by one. Hayes remained by the river until the cold reached through his jacket. He did not feel free. He did not feel lost. He felt reduced to something smaller and more honest, a man without a ledger, standing beside moving water, waiting for the dark to arrive without demanding explanation. Night settled slowly, without drama. The river turned black first, then the trees along its banks dissolved into shadow. Hayes sat in the Ford with the engine off, listening to the small sounds of cooling metal. The town lights shimmered faintly in the distance, fragile and unnecessary. He understood that no one was looking for him. Not the factory, not the bank, not even the diner. Hunger arrived quietly. It did not accuse him. It simply existed. He checked his pockets again out of habit. Lint, an old receipt, nothing else. The absence felt cleaner than the card had. For years he had measured himself against numbers hours worked, payments due, interest rising in the dark. Now there was nothing calculating him. He drove back toward town one last time. The diner's neon buzzed against the glass, steady in its fatigue. Claire was inside, stacking cups. She glanced up as he entered. There was no surprise in her expression, only recognition. "Kitchen's closed," she said gently. "That's all right." He stood there a moment longer, absorbing the warmth of the room, the smell of coffee grounds and disinfectant. It was not home, but it was light. Claire reached beneath the counter and slid a wrapped sandwich toward him without comment. He hesitated, then accepted it with a nod. No ledger recorded this exchange. Outside, the air had turned sharp. Hayes sat in the truck and ate slowly, watching the condensation form along the windshield. The engine remained silent. He no longer felt like a man escaping or rebelling. He felt like someone reduced to first element's hunger, breath, the need for shelter. When the lights in the diner went out, he did not follow them with his eyes. He started the Ford and steered toward the highway. The road ahead was unmarked by promise. It did not offer redemption or punishment. It offered distance. And for now, distance was enough.